Picture yourself standing on a dock in 1858, watching a ship disappear into the Bay of Bengal. The men aboard will never return home. Not because they'll die, but because they're about to enter a machine so precise, so calculated in its cruelty, that it will delete their very identities. 868 nautical miles from the mainland. That's not just distance. That's a mathematical equation for despair. The British didn't just build a prison on the Andaman Islands. They built a laboratory for breaking the human soul, one cell at a time. The cellular jail cost the equivalent of $47 million in today's money. 7 wings radiating from a central tower like spokes on a wheel designed to crush rather than turn. 496 cells, each measuring exactly 9 feet by 4.5 feet. Every dimension calculated to provide the minimum space necessary to sustain life while maximizing psychological pressure. But here's what the architects never anticipated: political prisoners who arrived not broken, but believing. Men who transformed isolation into meditation, punishment into education, and systematic oppression into systematic resistance. The oil mill, the kolhu, where prisoners were yoked like animals to grind seeds 16 hours a day. The sound became the prison's heartbeat, industrial noise masking human breakdown, until the day the grinding stopped. Not because the machine broke, but because the men inside it discovered something more powerful than any architecture ever built. Today, we're opening the classified files on history's most sophisticated experiment in total control. We're going to walk through those corridors, examine the blueprints, and uncover how a building designed to eliminate hope instead created a university for revolution. This is the dark story of the cellular jail, where the British Empire's most advanced technology for breaking human beings met something they never calculated: the unbreakable human spirit. Join us as we forensically reconstruct exactly how systematic oppression creates systematic resistance, and why this story matters more today than ever before. Picture a horizon line drawn in salt and sweat. The Bay of Bengal stretches endlessly, a liquid barrier more absolute than any wall built by human hands. The year is 1857, and a ship cuts through these waters carrying men who will never see home again. The first prison wall isn't made of stone. It's made of distance. 868 nautical miles separate these islands from Calcutta, a measurement that transforms geography into policy, water into razor wire. The journey takes 14 days when the monsoons cooperate, 23 when they don't. Every mile of ocean becomes another layer of security, another guarantee that what happens here stays here. Port Blair emerges from the morning haze like a fever dream made manifest. The air tastes of salt and decay, thick enough to drink, humid enough to drown in. Palm fronds hang motionless in the stillness, waiting. The island breathes slowly, deliberately, as if conserving energy for what's coming. Supply ships arrive monthly when weather permits, quarterly when it doesn't. Each vessel carries more than cargo. It carries the mathematical precision of exile. 17 tons of rice calculated down to the last grain, 340 pounds of dal, 47 cases of medical supplies, though mercy here comes measured in teaspoons. Every screw, every nail, every bandage represents a decision made by men who will never feel the weight of these chains. The logistics of abandonment follow strict protocols. Ration calculations become exercises in controlled starvation. Shipping manifests read like death warrants written in accounting ledger ink. Distance transforms every necessity into luxury, every comfort into impossibility. But distance alone isn't enough. Fear requires a deeper foundation. Kala Pani, Blackwater. The phrase carries more terror than any physical torture device ever could. In 1857, crossing the ocean means losing caste, losing identity, losing the very essence of what makes a man human in the eyes of his community. The British understand this. They weaponize it. The water itself becomes an instrument of psychological annihilation. The ship's wake disappears behind them, erasing their path home. No breadcrumbs, no trail. Just the endless repetition of waves that sound like whispered promises. You are nothing now. You are nothing now. You are nothing now. Through the tree line, something darker than shadow takes shape, a silhouette that shouldn't exist, geometry that defies the organic chaos of tropical vegetation. 7 straight lines radiating from a central point like the spokes of a wheel designed to crush rather than turn. The building emerges gradually, deliberately, as if it's been waiting for this moment of revelation. This isn't just a prison. This is something else entirely. Something built not to hold bodies but to delete souls. The officials didn't choose the Andaman Islands as a location. They chose them as a method. Distance as policy. Isolation as technology. Abandonment as statecraft. The year is 1858, and the Site Selection Committee has finished its work. Their report, filed in triplicate and bound in leather that will outlast most of the men they're planning to bury here, reads like a medical prescription written for an entire nation's fever dreams. Remote enough to prevent escape, accessible enough to maintain supply lines, tropical enough to serve as its own punishment. The language is clinical, bureaucratic, laundered clean of human consequence, but between the lines, a darker arithmetic emerges. The committee surveyed 7 potential sites across the archipelago. They measured elevation, drainage patterns, wind direction, soil composition. They calculated the optimal distance from the harbor, close enough for supply deliveries, far enough to muffle screams. They studied tidal charts, monsoon schedules, the life cycle of local diseases. They treated geography like a weapon and climate like a collaborator. Port Blair wins the competition by a margin of misery. The harbor provides natural shelter for ships while offering no escape route for men. The surrounding hills create a natural amphitheater, acoustically designed to contain sound within and amplify silence beyond. The soil drains well enough to prevent complete flooding, but poorly enough to guarantee perpetual dampness, ideal conditions for respiratory ailments and skin diseases. But the real genius lies in the selection of the exact site within Port Blair itself. Not the highest ground. That would provide too much dignity, too much perspective. Not the lowest. That would flood and kill too quickly, ending the experiment before it produces useful data. Instead, they choose a slight elevation, just enough to suggest hope while guaranteeing despair. The surveyor's reports document everything with obsessive precision. Elevation: 47 feet above mean sea level. Annual rainfall: 118 inches, concentrated between May and October. Average humidity: 87%. Maximum recorded temperature: 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Minimum 73 degrees. The numbers read like a torture manual written in meteorological code. They test soil samples. They measure water table depth. They calculate drainage capacity during monsoon season. Every environmental factor becomes a variable in an equation designed to produce suffering at maximum efficiency with minimum cost. The island isn't just distant, it's alive in all the wrong ways. Salt air corrodes metal faster than time. Humidity warps wood into new shapes. Insects breed in geometric progression. The climate itself becomes a guard, working 24 hours a day without salary or complaint. Mold grows in patterns that suggest intelligence. Rust spreads like cancer through iron and steel. The very air attacks anything foreign, anything imposed, anything that doesn't belong to this ecosystem of decay. Buildings age in dog years here. Materials fail not gradually but catastrophically, suddenly, without warning. The officials study these failure patterns with scientific detachment. They document how quickly different alloys corrode, how various woods respond to constant moisture, which construction techniques survive tropical assault. They're building more than a prison. They're conducting a research project in environmental torture. The final environmental assessment arrives with the monsoon rains. The climate will serve as our most reliable enforcer. No prisoner will escape the weather, and no structure will survive without constant maintenance. The island itself will serve as both warden and executioner. Then comes the decision that transforms everything. The prison will be cellular, not barracks, not dormitories, not communal spaces of any kind. One man to one box, complete isolation as the foundational principle, the word cellular carries scientific precision, like cells in a honeycomb, like cells in a prison, like cells in a body, separate but connected, individual, but serving a larger organism. The human beings who will occupy these spaces aren't considered in the terminology. They're just the biological material that will fill the architectural experiment. One man to one box. The phrase becomes a mantra, repeated in every planning document, every budget proposal, every architectural specification. Isolation isn't an accident or a byproduct. It's the entire point. The blueprint emerges slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. 7 wings radiating from a central watchtower, each wing containing 56 cells, each cell designed to hold one human being in complete sensory and social deprivation. The design isn't original. It's borrowed from Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, that philosophical fever dream of total surveillance wrapped in utilitarian theory. But this version carries tropical modifications, adjustments for climate and distance that make the original seem almost humane by comparison. The central tower rises 3 stories, crowned with a lantern room that will burn through the night. From this single point, one guard can observe all 7 wings simultaneously. But the genius of the design lies not in what it shows, but in what it hides. The prisoners can never be certain whether they're being watched or not. The possibility of surveillance becomes more powerful than surveillance itself. Each wing extends exactly 150 feet from the central hub, like spokes on a wheel designed to brake rather than turn. The angles are precise, calculated to maximize visibility while minimizing communication. No wing intersects with another. No corridor offers refuge from the tower's gaze. The building itself enforces separation with mathematical precision. The corridors carry sound in strange ways. Footsteps echo, but voices don't. Whispers die within 3 feet, but screams travel for miles. The acoustics aren't accidental. They're engineered. The building is designed to amplify the sounds of authority while muffling the sounds of humanity. Sightlines are calculated to the inch. From any point within the tower, a single guard can see down the entire length of any wing. But prisoners looking down their corridor see only a narrow slice of their neighbors' cells. Never enough to make eye contact, never enough to establish human connection. The architecture itself prohibits solidarity. The doors are designed to make noise. Heavy iron hinges that scream when opened, locks that clank with finality when turned, bolts that slide home with sounds like breaking bones. Every mechanical sound becomes a reminder of powerlessness. Every opening and closing a small death. Windows are positioned strategically, high enough to prevent escape, small enough to limit light, angled to eliminate the possibility of communication between cells. Prisoners will see sky but never horizon. They'll experience weather but never freedom. The architectural thesis is chillingly simple. If prisoners can't communicate, they can't organize. If they can't organize, they can't resist. If they can't resist, they can't hope. If they can't hope, they cease to be human in any meaningful sense. Silence becomes security. Isolation becomes insurance. Architecture becomes alchemy, transforming human beings into controllable units of stored energy, ready to be deployed for labor when needed, returned to storage when not. But architecture, like all human endeavors, carries unintended consequences. The planners designed their system to prevent communication, but they failed to anticipate what happens when silence itself becomes a form of communication. They engineer isolation, but they don't consider how isolation might ferment rather than pacify, how it might concentrate rather than dilute human will. The plans are approved in triplicate. The contracts are signed in perpetuity. The blueprints are blessed with administrative holy water. Construction begins with the turning of the first shovel, a ceremonial gesture that breaks ground and breaks something deeper, the last barrier between theory and practice, between imagination and implementation. But the island fights back from the very first day. The monsoon arrives 3 weeks early, turning the construction site into a lake of red mud that swallows tools and machinery whole. Workers develop fever that comes in waves, delirium that speaks in tongues they don't recognize. Equipment rusts before it can be unpacked. The jungle reclaims cleared ground faster than it can be re-cleared. Every material brought to the island faces immediate assault. Lime mortar crumbles under humidity. Iron bolts expand and contract with temperature swings until they snap. Timber warps into shapes that mock geometric intention. The very elements conspire against human ambition. Shipping delays become military campaigns against calendar and budget. Supply ships that should arrive monthly come quarterly when they come at all. Materials ordered in January arrive in July, weathered beyond recognition, damaged beyond utility. Each delay compounds the next, creating cascading failures that transform construction into archaeology before the building is even completed. The workforce shrinks through attrition. Some die of disease, some die of accident, some simply disappear into the jungle, choosing unknown dangers over certain ones. The survivors work under conditions that would be considered punitive even by the standards of the prison they're building. But the most insidious enemy is heat. Not just temperature, that can be measured, predicted, defended against. This is something deeper. Thermal exhaustion that saps will before it saps strength, humidity that makes breathing feel like drowning, sun that bleaches color from everything it touches. Workers collapse mid-task, their bodies simply surrendering to environmental impossibility. Heatstroke becomes a daily occurrence, scheduled as regularly as meal breaks. The site medic maintains a tally that reads like casualty reports from an undeclared war. Yet construction continues, driven by bureaucratic momentum and imperial necessity. Every setback generates reports. Every delay spawns investigations. Every failure produces recommendations for improvement. The machine of administration grinds forward, fueled by documentation and lubricated by human sacrifice. The real engineering drama plays out in microscopic battles between human intention and tropical reality. Lime specifications tested in London, climate prove worthless in Andaman humidity. Iron alloys chosen for strength dissolve in salt air. Timber grades selected for durability become food for insects that exist nowhere else on Earth. Each material failure teaches lessons too expensive to implement. The good mortar costs 3 times the budget mortar. The rust-resistant bolts require shipping delays that push completion beyond acceptable timelines. The insect-resistant wood grows only in regions controlled by hostile tribes, so compromises accumulate like silt. Good enough becomes the standard. Temporary solutions become permanent fixtures. Small concessions to practicality create large vulnerabilities to exploitation. The builders construct not just a prison, but a catalog of their own limitations, a permanent record of every corner cut and every standard lowered. The workers begin to whisper about sabotage, not human sabotage, but environmental, as if the island itself has developed intelligence, agency, intention, as if every structural failure represents not just natural decay, but active resistance. Metal screams when it rusts here. Wood groans when it warps. Stone sweats when it absorbs moisture. The building materials seem to suffer, and their suffering creates sounds, a constant low-frequency moan that will later become the prison's background noise, the audio signature of institutional decay. Yet somehow, impossibly, the structure rises, wing by wing, cell by cell, bar by bar. The 7 spokes take shape. The central tower grows skyward. The panopticon assumes its final form despite every environmental effort to prevent it. The budget becomes more than numbers. It becomes character, personality, motive. The ledgers tell stories more revealing than any diary, more honest than any official report. Initial estimate, 200,000 rupees. Final cost, 473,000 rupees, not including the hidden expenses that won't appear in official accounting until decades later. Every rupee carries the weight of human consequence. Every line item represents someone's suffering converted into administrative convenience. The arithmetic of cruelty requires precision. 496 cells, each measuring 9 feet by 4 feet 6 inches. 7,000 square feet of human storage space, calculated to maximize density while maintaining the illusion of individual containment. The mathematics is elegant in its efficiency, horrifying in its implications. Labor costs dominate the budget, but not in ways anyone expected. The original plan assumed local workers would provide cheap, reliable construction services. Instead, the workforce becomes a revolving door of sickness, death, and desertion. Replacement workers cost more, work slower, die faster. The budget hemorrhages money, trying to maintain adequate staffing levels for basic construction tasks. Shipping costs multiply like cancer cells. Every tool, every nail, every pound of cement must travel 868 nautical miles at risk of weather, pirates, and mechanical failure. Insurance rates for Andaman deliveries exceed the cost of materials themselves. Supply redundancy, ordering 3 of everything in hope that one will arrive intact, transforms every purchase into gambling. The workforce isn't just employed, it's managed like a population: housing for workers, food for workers, medical care for workers, security for workers, entertainment for workers. Each support structure requires its own budget line, its own administrative apparatus, its own failure protocols. The British import workers from across the empire, Bengalis, Punjabis, Tamils, Burmese, even Chinese coolies recruited through Hong Kong contractors. Each group requires different management strategies, different dietary accommodations, different cultural considerations. The construction site becomes a miniature empire, complete with ethnic tensions and linguistic barriers. Skilled trades command premium wages that make accountants weep. A competent mason earns more in Port Blair than a civil servant earns in Calcutta. A reliable carpenter charges rates that would be criminal in London. Every craftsman who agrees to work on the project does so, knowing they're risking their lives for money, and they price their services accordingly. But the real expense isn't visible in the ledgers. It's embedded in the design specifications. The prison is expensive not because it is grand, but because it is precise. Hundreds of identical cells require thousands of identical fittings. Every lock must match every other lock. Every door must align with every other door. Every bar must conform to standardized specifications that prevent improvised weapons or tools. The metalwork alone costs more than entire buildings in mainland India. Iron bars, steel bolts, brass locks, copper pipes, all imported, all expensive, all essential. The prison requires 11,000 individual metal components, each manufactured to exact tolerances, each tested to failure specifications. Window grates cost 8 rupees per cell. Door hinges cost 3 rupees per cell. Lock mechanisms cost 12 rupees per cell. The mathematical precision of confinement creates geometric progression of expense. Food service infrastructure requires its own architectural complexity. Kitchens designed to feed 500 men simultaneously. Storage systems calculated to maintain nutrition standards while preventing spoilage in tropical heat. Distribution networks that deliver measured portions to individual cells without creating opportunities for communication or revolt. Medical facilities represent another hidden cost multiplier, not because the administration cares about prisoner health, but because dead prisoners provide no labor value and create disposal problems. The infirmary costs 27,000 rupees to construct and equip, more than many entire government buildings. Then comes the final design detail that lands like a verdict read in a courtroom built for condemnation. The cells are built with minimal human function, not minimal comfort. Function. The difference is crucial and deliberate. Each cell contains one sleeping platform built from stone, one waste bucket built from iron, one water vessel built from clay, nothing else. No chair, no table, no shelf, no hook for hanging clothes. No accommodation for reading, writing, or any activity that might suggest intellectual life. The sleeping platform measures 18 inches wide, 6 feet long, raised 4 inches from the floor. Not wide enough for comfortable sleep, not narrow enough to fall off accidentally. The dimensions force prisoners to sleep in specific positions, creating chronic discomfort that accumulates over months and years into permanent physical damage. The waste bucket has no lid, no handle, no provision for privacy or sanitation. Emptying protocols require prisoners to present their buckets for inspection at scheduled times, transforming basic biological necessity into opportunity for humiliation. The water vessel holds exactly 1 day's ration when filled. No more, no less. Measurements precise to the fluid ounce, designed to provide survival-level hydration while creating constant awareness of dependency. Ventilation systems are calculated to provide barely adequate air circulation, enough to prevent immediate suffocation, insufficient to provide comfort. Each cell receives exactly 47 cubic feet of airflow per hour. The number appears arbitrary but represents careful calibration between survival and suffering. The audience realizes, gradually and horribly, that comfort isn't omitted by accident. Every apparent oversight represents deliberate decision. Every missing amenity reflects conscious choice. The cells aren't incomplete. They're precisely engineered to provide the minimum conditions necessary to maintain life while maximizing psychological pressure. The construction documents include detailed specifications for elements that were deliberately excluded, plans for cell furniture that was deemed unnecessarily humane, designs for ventilation systems that were rejected as too generous, shade, proposals for sanitation facilities that were abandoned as contrary to disciplinary objectives. The prison opens on May 10, 1858. No ceremony, no speeches, no ribbon cutting. Just the simple turning of keys in locks, the first systematic application of theory to human flesh. The first prisoners arrive by ship, chained in groups of 12, processed like cargo being transferred from one storage facility to another. They see the building for the first time from the harbor, 7 wings reaching toward them like fingers of a hand closing into a fist. The intake protocols transform human beings into inventory items through systematic humiliation dressed as administrative necessity. Names become numbers. Clothing becomes standardized uniforms. Hair becomes stubble. Personal possessions become contraband. Identity becomes a luxury the state can no longer afford to provide. Each prisoner undergoes medical examination, not for their benefit, but for institutional protection. The doctors document existing injuries, chronic conditions, communicable diseases, signs of mental instability. The records protect the administration from later accusations of abuse while establishing baseline conditions for measuring deterioration. Photography sessions create permanent records that will outlive most of their subjects. Front view, side view, identifying scars and tattoos, measurements of height and weight. The cameras capture not just physical appearance, but something deeper, the exact moment when hope begins its long process of starvation. Fingerprinting introduces scientific precision to the business of human tracking. Each prisoner's unique biological signatures are recorded, cataloged, filed for future reference. The technology transforms individual identity into administrative data, personal characteristics into bureaucratic tools. Cell assignments follow protocols designed to prevent organization and punish leadership. Known associates are separated. Family members are placed in different wings. Regional and linguistic groups are deliberately scattered to eliminate cultural solidarity. The first sound each prisoner hears upon entering his cell is the lock engaging, not slamming, not crashing, but sliding home with mechanical finality. Click. The sound that will mark the beginning and end of every day for the rest of their lives. The keys themselves become characters in the drama. Hand-forged iron, each one unique, each one numbered, each one assigned to specific locks according to master schedules that prevent unauthorized access. The sound of keys jangling announces authority approaching. The absence of key sounds means abandonment, isolation, the terrible silence of being forgotten. But the real horror isn't violence. It's routine. The establishment of patterns that will repeat until repetition becomes existence, until existence becomes indistinguishable from death. Wake up at 5:30, cell inspection at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work assignment at 7, labor until 5, dinner at 5:30, cell time until lights out at 9. 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for however many years the sentence demands or the body survives, whichever comes first. The routine transforms time into a weapon. Days become indistinguishable, weeks lose meaning, months collapse into years without transition or variation. The calendar becomes an instrument of torture more precise than any physical device. Night falls on the central tower like curtains closing on a stage where the same play will run forever. One lantern burns above 7 wings, casting light down corridors designed to carry illumination to every cell while providing comfort to none. The tower doesn't guide ships safely to harbor. Ships aren't supposed to come here voluntarily. Instead, it watches men drown on dry land, marks time in units of human dissolution, serves as lighthouse for a coastline where hope goes to die. The lantern burns whale oil imported from Massachusetts, irony wrapped in economic necessity. American whales die to light British justice administered to Indian prisoners on an island that belongs to none of them. The flame itself becomes symbol of the imperial system, consuming resources from everywhere to serve purposes that benefit no one. Guards begin their night patrols, footsteps echoing down corridors designed to amplify the sounds of authority while muffling the sounds of humanity. Their lanterns cast moving shadows that dance across cell bars, creating patterns of light and darkness that suggest movement where none exists, hope where none remains. From the tower, the 7 wings look like compass points marking directions no one wants to travel: north toward madness, south toward despair, east toward death, west toward dissolution, and the other directions toward territories that don't yet have names but will, given time, acquire them through the accumulated experience of human suffering. The night sounds begin, metal contracting in cooling air, wood settling into new configurations, insects claiming territory in the shadows, but underneath these natural noises runs another soundtrack. The nearly inaudible sound of 500 men breathing in perfect isolation, their collective respiration creating rhythms that suggest a larger organism, a corporate body that inhales suffering and exhales despair in measured doses. The first night establishes patterns that will govern every night that follows. The building learns its own sounds, its own schedules, its own personality. It becomes more than architecture. It becomes a machine designed to process human hope into administrative convenience, to transform political resistance into industrial productivity. And in the morning, the machine will begin its real work. 5:30 in the morning arrives like a judgment rendered in mechanical precision. The bell tower erupts into life, brass striking brass in rhythms calculated to penetrate sleep without offering comfort. The sound travels down each corridor at exactly the same velocity, reaches each cell at exactly the same moment, transforms 500 individual sleeps into one collective awakening. But this isn't waking. It's resurrection from a death that lasts exactly 8 hours and 30 minutes, repeated every day until repetition becomes existence, until existence becomes indistinguishable from mechanical function. Cell inspection begins 6 minutes after the bell stops ringing, enough time to stand, fold the single blanket into regulation dimensions, arrange the waste bucket in the specified position, assume the required posture beside the door. Not enough time for thought, reflection, or the luxury of voluntary movement. The guards walk the corridors with military precision, bootsteps echoing off stone walls designed to amplify authority while muffling humanity. Keys jangle in rhythm, not random percussion but calculated psychological pressure. The sound announces power approaching, control visiting, the machinery of the state making its daily inspection of human inventory. Each cell door opens for exactly 45 seconds, enough time to verify the prisoner's continued existence, inspect the cell's contents for contraband or unauthorized modifications, confirm that institutional order remains intact. Not enough time for eye contact, conversation, or recognition of human dignity. The guards carry clipboards, not weapons. The real violence here is bureaucratic. Names checked against lists, numbers verified against rosters, physical conditions documented for administrative protection. The prisoners aren't just confined. They're cataloged, filed, reduced to data points in a management system that processes human beings like raw materials in an industrial operation. breakfast arrives at 6:30 exactly. Thin rice porridge that tastes of institutional efficiency and calculated nutrition. Each portion measured to provide exactly the minimum calories necessary to sustain labor capacity while maintaining chronic hunger. The mathematics of starvation wrapped in the language of scientific dietary management. The food arrives through slots cut into cell doors, openings sized to accommodate metal bowls but not human hands reaching outward. Even the act of eating becomes an exercise in isolation, nutrition transformed into solitary confinement with every spoonful. Water rations accompany each meal, 1 pint per prisoner, measured precisely, distributed under observation. Not enough to satisfy thirst, too much to create immediate desperation. The liquid itself becomes currency in an economy of controlled scarcity. 7 o'clock marks the beginning of the real horror, not torture, not violence, but work assignments distributed through a system designed to break human will through the application of industrial routine. The oil mill waits in the central courtyard like a medieval instrument updated for modern institutional efficiency. Kolhu, the grinding mechanism that transforms seeds into oil and men into machines through the simple application of repetitive physical labor under coercion. The system requires no innovation, no expertise, no skill. Just bodies capable of sustained circular motion, minds numbed enough to accept endless repetition, spirits broken enough to transform resistance into compliance. Human beings become components in a manufacturing process that produces oil for institutional lamps and despair for institutional control. 12 men per shift, harnessed to wooden beams that radiate from a central grinding stone. The mechanical principle is ancient. Oxen replaced by prisoners, animal labor upgraded to human labor without changing the fundamental relationship between power and submission. The Kolhu demands constant motion. No rest periods, no scheduled breaks, no accommodation for fatigue or human limitation. Movement stops only when the shift ends or when a prisoner collapses. The machine doesn't distinguish between voluntary and involuntary cessation of labor. Output quotas are calculated with scientific precision. Each 12-man team must produce 8 gallons of oil per 8-hour shift. The mathematics breaks down to individual responsibility. 2 quarts per prisoner per day, measured, weighed, recorded in ledgers that will outlive most of their producers. Seed weight determines daily assignments. Mustard seeds require different grinding pressures than sesame. Coconut demands different techniques than linseed. The prisoners become specialists in industrial procedures they never chose to learn, experts in production processes that serve purposes they'll never understand. Rotation schedules prevent rest through systematic redistribution of physical strain. The outer positions require sustained pulling against maximum resistance. The inner positions demand quick stepping to maintain rhythm. No position offers relief, only different forms of controlled exhaustion. The punishment ladder escalates through bureaucratic progression. Failure to meet quota results in reduced food rations. Repeated failure results in extended work hours. Continued failure results in individual assignments to smaller mills designed for single prisoner operation. Isolation within isolation. Labor within labor. Despair within despair. The Kolhu's voice becomes the prison's second heartbeat, a grinding mechanical rhythm that drowns out human sound while marking time in industrial increments. The stone wheel weighs 437 pounds, iron-reinforced and precisely balanced to maximize grinding efficiency while requiring maximum human effort to maintain rotation. The sound travels through the central courtyard, echoes off the tower walls, penetrates the corridor system designed to carry authority's noise while muffling humanity's cries. Prisoners in their cells hear the grinding continue without them, a reminder that the system operates regardless of individual participation or resistance. But the most insidious aspect isn't physical, it's temporal. The Kolhu transforms time into something measurable only through suffering. Minutes pass like hours when counted in grinding revolutions. Hours disappear like minutes when measured against daily quotas. Days become indistinguishable when marked only by repetitive mechanical motion. The oil produced feeds institutional lamps that burn through the night. illuminating guard posts and administrative offices with light extracted from human labor. The prisoners fuel their own surveillance, power their own confinement, literally generate the visibility that maintains their captivity. Workers develop physical deformations specific to Kolhu labor, shoulders that slope forward from pulling harness straps, spines that curve from sustained circular motion, hands that permanently curve around wooden beam handles. The human body adapts to institutional requirements, flesh conforming to mechanical demands. Yet the system's most terrifying feature isn't its efficiency, it's its redundancy. When one prisoner collapses, another immediately takes his position. When one team completes its shift, another team begins. The Kolhu never stops grinding, never pauses for human consideration, never acknowledges the cost of its continuous operation. The sound becomes so constant that silence, when it rarely occurs, feels unnatural, threatening, wrong. The prisoners' ears adjust to perpetual mechanical noise. Their bodies synchronize with grinding rhythms. Their breathing patterns align with Kolhu rotations. And then, inevitably, someone collapses. The question hangs in the humid air above the courtyard, unspoken but understood by every witness. Is the system supposed to stop, or is collapse part of the design? The answer arrives not in words, but in actions. The collapsed prisoner is dragged aside. A replacement takes his position. The grinding continues without pause, without acknowledgement, without even the courtesy of momentary silence to mark a human being's physical surrender. The machine operates exactly as intended. While the Kolhu grinds human will into institutional compliance above ground, a different horror unfolds in the infrastructure below. The systematic transformation of basic biological necessity into instruments of psychological torture. The latrine system serves 496 prisoners through 24 communal facilities, each designed to accommodate 20 men simultaneously while maintaining maximum discomfort and minimum privacy. The mathematics of humiliation calculated to the square foot. Waste removal follows schedules that prioritize institutional convenience over human dignity. Buckets emptied every third day during monsoon season, every second day during dry season, creating controlled cycles of filth that serve as environmental punishment for collective infractions. The disposal system routes human waste through channels that run directly beneath cell blocks, ensuring that the smell of institutional failure penetrates every living space. The building's plumbing becomes a delivery system for olfactory punishment, architectural engineering converted into atmospheric control. Water supply operates through rationing systems that treat hydration as privilege rather than necessity. Each prisoner receives 1 gallon per day for all purposes: drinking, washing, sanitation, cleaning. Not enough to maintain health, too much to create immediate crisis. Precisely calibrated to sustain life while guaranteeing chronic discomfort. The wells were dug to specific depths calculated to provide water that tastes of institutional control. Too mineral-heavy for refreshment, too contaminated for purity, too scarce for comfort. Even the most basic human need becomes an exercise in managed deprivation. Washing facilities consist of stone basins fed by gravity flow systems that operate for exactly 15 minutes twice weekly. Prisoners must complete all personal hygiene within these narrow windows, transforming cleanliness into competitive exercise under time pressure that eliminates any possibility of dignity or privacy. Drainage systems clog systematically, creating standing water that breeds disease vectors carefully managed to maintain illness rates just below epidemic thresholds. The administration documents infection patterns like agricultural yields, tracking sickness as a crop to be harvested for institutional benefit. Disease management operates through statistical protocols that treat human suffering as actuarial data, acceptable mortality rates calculated annually, optimal illness levels maintained seasonally, medical intervention provided only when deaths threaten to exceed budgetary projections for replacement prisoners. The infirmary contains 12 beds for 500 prisoners, a ratio that guarantees medical attention remains scarce enough to constitute privilege. Treatment depends not on medical need but on administrative value. Productive prisoners receive priority, troublemakers receive aspirin and isolation. Cholera arrives with monsoon rains, spreading through drainage systems that connect every cell to every other cell, through carefully engineered networks of contamination. The building's infrastructure becomes a circulatory system for disease, architectural planning converted into epidemiological warfare. Yet the real cruelty isn't accidental, it's scheduled. Discomfort arrives according to administrative timetables. Filth accumulates on bureaucratic schedules. Sickness spreads through channels designed to maximize institutional control while minimizing institutional responsibility. The guards maintain detailed logs of sanitation infractions, hygiene violations, and cleanliness failures. Every prisoner's bathroom habits documented for future reference, personal functions transformed into surveillance data, bodily autonomy reduced to administrative oversight. But perhaps the most insidious element is the systematic transformation of basic human dignity into institutional privilege. Clean water becomes reward for compliance. Adequate sanitation becomes incentive for productivity. Basic hygiene becomes currency in an economy controlled entirely by administrative discretion. The prisoners develop informal protocols for maintaining humanity within inhuman systems, shared water rations among the sick, collaborative washing schedules that maximize efficiency within minimal time windows, silent communication networks that coordinate group hygiene efforts without attracting administrative attention. Yet these adaptations serve institutional purposes as much as human ones. The administration documents adaptive behaviors as evidence that current conditions remain tolerable, that no policy changes are necessary, that the system operates within acceptable parameters of controlled suffering. The waste bucket in each cell becomes more than sanitation device. It becomes measurement tool for institutional control. Guards inspect contents, document irregularities, track patterns that might indicate illness, communication, or resistance activities. Human waste transformed into surveillance data. The smell becomes so constant that outsiders, administrators, visitors, supply personnel, can be identified immediately by their visible discomfort with atmospheric conditions that prisoners no longer notice. The nose adapts to institutional necessities, while the soul adapts to institutional impossibilities. And through it all, rumors travel through the silence like disease through the drainage system. Whispers about punishment protocols, speculation about medical experiments, stories about prisoners who disappeared into administrative records without leaving physical traces. The building processes human beings like raw materials, but unlike industrial operations, the waste products remain visible, present, incorporated into daily experience as reminders of institutional power over the most basic aspects of biological existence. The sanitation becomes weapon. The infrastructure becomes interrogation device. The plumbing becomes propaganda system that broadcasts institutional control through every sense simultaneously, every moment of every day, without pause or mercy, or acknowledgement of human cost. Above it all, the watchtower maintains its vigil, designed by Jeremy Bentham's theories, but modified by tropical reality into something more sinister than any philosophical thought experiment ever imagined. The panopticon principle seemed perfect in theoretical form. One guard observing all prisoners simultaneously, surveillance converted into architectural certainty, control embedded in geometric relationships between observer and observed. But theory assumes ideal conditions that don't exist in tropical archipelago reality. The tower stands 67 feet above ground level, offering sight lines calculated to penetrate every corridor simultaneously. But sight lines assume visibility, and visibility disappears when monsoon clouds descend like gray curtains that block observation for days at a time. Rain transforms the panopticon into a blind monument, a tower that watches nothing while everything happens in the spaces between drops. Prisoners develop activities timed to coincide with weather patterns, resistance synchronized with atmospheric conditions that neutralize architectural surveillance. Fog rolls in from the Bay of Bengal without warning or schedule, reducing visibility to arm's length, while the tower guard stares into gray soup that might conceal anything or nothing. The building's most sophisticated control mechanism becomes useless furniture when climate refuses to cooperate with institutional requirements. Darkness arrives differently in the tropics, not gradually, but suddenly, like a switch thrown without warning. Twilight lasts minutes, not hours. The tower guard maintains watch over shadows that might contain prisoners or might contain nothing, shapes that might indicate resistance or might indicate imagination. The lantern system, designed to provide 24-hour illumination, fails systematically due to supply shortages, equipment failures, and fuel shortages that transform surveillance schedules into darkness management protocols. Guards learn to patrol by sound rather than sight, developing audio surveillance skills that architects never anticipated. Lock mechanics become more important than visual observation when sight fails. The building contains 2,347 individual locking mechanisms, each requiring specific keys, each capable of failure at moments that coincide perfectly with surveillance breakdowns. Key control operates through protocols designed to prevent unauthorized access while ensuring rapid response to security emergencies. But keys multiply, disappear, reappear in wrong hands, get copied through methods that administration prefers not to investigate too thoroughly. Guard rotation schedules create brief windows of transition when responsibility transfers between shifts, new guards acclimate to positions, and experienced guards abandon posts before replacements complete orientation procedures. These moments accumulate into opportunities measured in minutes, but valuable beyond institutional calculation. The maintenance crews present the most insidious vulnerability in the entire security system. Repair workers must access every area, carry tools that could become weapons, possess knowledge of building systems that could facilitate escape or resistance. They wear institutional uniforms while maintaining contractor loyalties that don't necessarily align with institutional interests. Maintenance schedules require temporarily disabling security systems, locks removed for repair, bars disconnected for replacement, doors left open for cleaning. Each maintenance activity creates controlled vulnerabilities that smart prisoners learn to predict and exploit. The tower guard observes everything except the tower itself. Maintenance workers climb the structure, repair observation equipment, service lighting systems, and gain access to the building's most secure area through bureaucratic necessity rather than security clearance. Weather doesn't just limit visibility, it amplifies sound in ways that transform architectural acoustics into communication networks. Rain drumming on metal roofs masks whispered conversations. Wind howling through corridors covers coordinated movement. Thunder provides perfect cover for activities that require noise generation. The building was designed for perfect surveillance under ideal conditions, but conditions are never ideal. Equipment fails during monsoons. Personnel develop tropical diseases that affect performance. Supply chains break down at exactly the moments when security requires maximum efficiency. Guards develop informal protocols for managing surveillance gaps, administrative blind spots, and equipment failures that occur with systematic regularity. These adaptations become institutional knowledge that gets passed between shifts through verbal instructions that never appear in official documentation. But the most serious vulnerability isn't technological, it's human. The tower guard can observe everything except his own psychological state, his own growing familiarity with routine, his own gradual adaptation to institutional numbness that transforms vigilance into mechanical gesture. Prisoners learn to recognize guard personalities, work schedules, behavioral patterns that indicate attention levels. They develop intelligence networks more sophisticated than any criminal organization, gathering information through observation techniques that utilize architectural features designed to prevent exactly this type of coordination. Then comes the moment that proves architectural theory contains fatal flaws. A message gets passed between cells, a glance gets exchanged across corridor space designed to prevent eye contact. Contraband moves through a building designed to contain everything and everyone within strictly controlled boundaries. The breach isn't dramatic. Just two prisoners who manage eye contact for 3 seconds longer than architectural engineering calculated was possible. But in those 3 seconds, communication occurs. Human connection transcends institutional prevention. The building's fundamental purpose fails in the smallest possible way that proves the largest possible point. The panopticon assumes prisoners want to escape surveillance, but some prisoners want something more dangerous. They want to use surveillance to turn observation into communication. to convert the tower's gaze into a network of shared resistance. The system works perfectly except when it doesn't, and when it doesn't work, the failures cascade through networks of human ingenuity that prove architecture can contain bodies but never souls, can limit movement but never imagination, can enforce separation but never eliminate hope. The most sophisticated control mechanism ever designed by human intelligence meets the oldest force known to human experience: the refusal to surrender humanity regardless of institutional pressure. And humanity, as always, finds a way. The real prison isn't the building, it's the people who operate it. Guards, clerks, sweepers, repair crews, medical staff, administrative personnel, supply coordinators, security supervisors. Hundreds of employees trapped inside a system while wearing its keys. They aren't villains in any traditional sense. They're interfaces between policy and practice, human components in a machine designed to process other human beings through systematic application of controlled suffering. They carry out orders, follow procedures, implement policies that someone else created for purposes they don't always understand. The guards work 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Their living quarters occupy a separate compound adjacent to, but isolated from the prison proper, close enough to respond quickly to emergencies, far enough to maintain psychological distance from daily institutional horror. Most guards come from mainland India, recruited through military channels that promise steady employment, regular pay, and service to imperial order. They don't volunteer for ideological reasons. They volunteer for economic ones. The alternatives are poverty, unemployment, or military service in regions where getting killed is more likely than getting paid. The pay scale reflects institutional priorities. Guards earn more than clerks, supervisors earn more than guards. Medical staff earn more than everyone except administrative personnel. The hierarchy operates through financial incentives that reward collaboration with institutional purposes, regardless of moral consequence. Housing allocation follows administrative logic that maintains control over employees as carefully as control over prisoners. Married guards receive family quarters. Single guards share dormitory space. Everyone lives within walking distance of work, preventing the luxury of geographical separation between employment and identity. Food service for staff operates through the same supply chains that feed prisoners, but with dramatically different quality standards. Guards eat rice that prisoners can smell but never taste. They consume meat that exists in prisoner imagination only as memory. Their nutrition maintains health, while prisoner nutrition maintains survival. But economic incentives aren't enough to maintain institutional loyalty when employees witness daily operations that challenge basic human decency. The administration developed supplementary control mechanisms designed to manage staff psychology as carefully as prisoner compliance. Rotation schedules prevent guards from developing personal relationships with prisoners. No guard works the same section for more than 6 months. No guard supervises the same prisoners long enough to recognize individual humanity. The system treats empathy as security vulnerability and prevents it through administrative design. Reporting protocols require guards to document prisoner interactions, behavioral observations, rule violations, and compliance patterns. Every conversation becomes surveillance data. Every gesture becomes administrative evidence. Every moment of human connection becomes bureaucratic liability. The corruption economy develops naturally from scarcity management. Guards control access to basic necessities that prisoners need for survival: extra food, clean water, medical attention, news from outside, communication opportunities, protection from other prisoners. Black market transactions operate through networks that parallel official supply chains. Guards smuggle tobacco, paper, writing implements, medicines, even letters in exchange for information, cooperation, or simply entertainment value derived from watching prisoners compete for minimal improvements in survival conditions. The administration tolerates certain levels of corruption because it serves institutional interests. Guards who supplement their income through prisoner exploitation become invested in maintaining the system that enables their secondary income streams. Corruption creates complicity, but corruption also creates vulnerability. Guards who accept prisoner bribes become subject to prisoner blackmail. Guards who provide unauthorized privileges become dependent on prisoner silence. The power dynamic shifts in ways that administrative protocols don't anticipate or address. Moral fractures develop gradually, then suddenly. One guard bends a rule to help a sick prisoner. Another guard reports the violation to protect himself from complicity charges. The incident creates divisions within staff that mirror prisoner divisions. Institutional pressure turned inward. Control mechanisms applied to controllers. The guard who showed mercy gets transferred to administrative duties, effectively punished for humanitarian impulse. The guard who reported him receives commendation for institutional loyalty, effectively rewarded for betraying human decency. The message travels through staff quarters like disease through drainage systems. Survival requires collaboration with institutional logic, regardless of personal conscience. Support staff develop their own relationships with institutional horror. Clerks who process prisoner files learn to treat human beings as paperwork, personal histories as administrative data, individual tragedies as bookkeeping entries. They develop psychological numbness as professional requirement. Medical staff face the most complex moral challenges. Their professional training demands healing, but their institutional employment requires maintaining prisoner health just above the threshold of death, keeping human beings functional enough for labor while preventing recovery enough for resistance. Repair crews possess the most dangerous knowledge and the most privileged access. They understand building systems, security mechanisms, architectural vulnerabilities that could facilitate escape or resistance. The administration monitors them more carefully than it monitors prisoners, treating essential employees as potential security threats. Kitchen staff control food distribution, the most powerful tool for influencing prisoner behavior. They determine portion sizes, meal quality, distribution schedules that affect institutional morale and individual survival rates. Their cooperation becomes essential for maintaining control over prisoner populations. Sweepers and maintenance workers move through the entire facility, observe everything, possess access to all areas while maintaining the lowest institutional status. They see interactions between guards and prisoners that supervisors never witness. They hear conversations that official channels never record. The invisible chorus of institutional operation includes family members who live on compound, children who grow up inside walls designed to contain criminals, wives who maintain households within sight of human suffering they're trained to ignore through selective blindness. Staff develop elaborate psychological defense mechanisms to maintain sanity while participating in systematic dehumanization. They compartmentalize job requirements from personal values. They rationalize participation through appeals to legal authority, imperial necessity, and professional duty. Yet, psychological defenses create psychological vulnerabilities. Staff who suppress humanitarian instincts develop depression, anxiety, and behavioral problems that affect job performance. The institution that breaks prisoners also breaks employees, though through different mechanisms toward different purposes. The administration documents staff psychological breakdowns as carefully as prisoner breakdowns, tracking patterns that indicate optimal employment duration before institutional exposure creates management liabilities. Human resource management becomes another form of population control. Transfer policies ensure that employees who develop uncomfortable knowledge about institutional operations get reassigned before they accumulate enough evidence to threaten administrative narrative control. The system protects itself through geographic redistribution of institutional witnesses, but the most insidious element is the gradual transformation of ordinary people into institutional components through economic necessity, professional pressure, and social isolation. The system doesn't recruit monsters. It creates them through systematic exposure to normalized horror under bureaucratic protection. The guards aren't evil, they're employees, and that distinction makes their participation more terrifying than any malicious intent could ever be. They clock in, follow procedures, process human beings through administrative protocols, and clock out to return to families, hobbies, personal lives that exist in psychological space completely separate from professional activities. The banality of institutional evil reduced to employment practices and in the end, they sleep soundly because they're just doing their jobs. The first crack in the institutional facade appears not as dramatic rebellion, but as coordinated silence. 500 men who simultaneously refuse to speak, work, eat, or acknowledge institutional authority through the simple application of unified non-participation. The hunger strike begins on a Tuesday morning when breakfast arrives to cells whose occupants remain lying down, eyes closed, breathing so softly that guards must check pulses to verify continued life. No communication precedes the action. No planning gets detected. No leadership emerges to provide targets for institutional retaliation. The coordination is perfect because it requires no coordination. Every prisoner simply decides, independently but simultaneously, to refuse participation in his own destruction. The building fills with silence more terrifying than any noise riot could produce. Guards conduct normal morning inspections to discover cell after cell of apparently comatose prisoners who respond to no verbal commands, physical contact, or procedural provocation. The entire institutional routine collapses into meaningless gesture when its human components simply opt out of mechanical cooperation. Administrative protocols provide no procedures for universal passive resistance. The system is designed to handle individual rebellion, small group coordination, and even violent uprising. But 500 simultaneous acts of non-participation create administrative paralysis. Medical staff receive emergency calls to examine prisoners for illness, poisoning, or epidemic outbreak that might explain collective unresponsiveness. They discover perfectly healthy men who simply refuse to function as institutional components. Human beings who have chosen biological strike action as political statement. The hunger strike operates through biological arithmetic that transforms physical suffering into political pressure. Each day without food reduces prisoner body weight by an average of 2 pounds. Each day without water reduces survival probability by measurable percentages. The prisoners weaponize their own mortality. But hunger strikes in isolated facilities create different dynamics than hunger strikes in public spaces. No newspapers report the situation. No politicians face pressure for intervention. No public opinion demands resolution. The silence extends beyond the prison walls into administrative blackout that treats prisoner resistance as classified information. The institutional response follows medical protocols designed to maintain prisoner health without acknowledging political motives. Force-feeding procedures get implemented through rubber tubes, nutrient solutions, and restraint systems that transform medical care into physical torture. Doctors participate in feeding procedures that violate medical ethics while serving institutional necessity. They calculate nutrient requirements, monitor vital signs, and maintain prisoner survival against prisoner will through technological intervention that uses medical equipment for political purposes. The feeding process requires strapping prisoners to tables, forcing tubes through nasal passages, pumping liquid nutrition directly into stomachs that reject institutional sustenance through immediate vomiting that ruins procedure effectiveness while creating sanitation nightmares. Guards develop procedures for cleaning vomit, replacing soiled restraints, and managing prisoners who use bodily functions as resistance weapons. The institution discovers that controlling human bodies requires controlling human biology at levels that demand medical expertise and custodial cooperation. Weight monitoring becomes daily procedure. Prisoners get weighed, measured, examined for signs of physical deterioration that might indicate approaching death and administrative liability. Medical charts document resistance through biological data that tracks prisoner commitment to political starvation. The administration faces practical deadline pressure. Prisoners can survive without food for approximately 40 days under optimal conditions, 20 days under institutional conditions. After 30 days, medical intervention becomes necessary to prevent deaths that would require official explanation. But the strike creates publicity vulnerability that administrators fear more than prisoner mortality. News of hunger strikes travels despite communication restrictions. Families develop concerns about missing letters. Political sympathizers begin asking questions about prisoner welfare. The institution's greatest strength, isolation, becomes its greatest weakness when dealing with resistance strategies that create external pressure through internal suffering. Remote location protects the administration from oversight, but also prevents spin control when problems demand public attention. International attention arrives through channels that administration cannot control. Missionary reports, medical society concerns, legal observer inquiries that transform internal institutional matters into external political problems. The strike succeeds by converting local suffering into global embarrassment. Political pressure mounts through networks that recognize hunger strikes as universal resistance language that transcends cultural and linguistic barriers. The prisoners communicate with audiences beyond institutional control through the simple expedient of refusing to eat until their demands receive serious consideration. But demands themselves become problematic because prisoners never articulate specific requests. Their resistance operates as pure negation, refusal to participate without offering alternative arrangements. The administration cannot negotiate with positions that haven't been stated. The strike ends not through institutional concession, but through prisoner decision that resistance has achieved its political purpose. On the 41st day, breakfast disappears from cell after cell as 500 men simultaneously resume eating without explanation or announcement. Guards discover prisoners calmly consuming institutional food as if nothing unusual had occurred. No victory celebrations, no resistance speeches, no acknowledgement of political achievement. Just resumed participation in daily routine as mysteriously coordinated as the original refusal. The administration documents the incident as medical emergency successfully resolved through proper procedures. Official reports describe temporary illness outbreak treated through appropriate medical intervention. No mention appears of political resistance or institutional policy challenges. But unofficial reports travel through networks that institutional control cannot reach. Guards write letters to families. Medical staff share experiences with colleagues. Supply personnel observe changes that suggest recent crisis management beyond normal operational parameters. The hunger strike succeeds not because it forces institutional change, but because it proves institutional vulnerability. The system depends on prisoner cooperation in their own confinement. Without that cooperation, the machinery of control simply stops functioning regardless of administrative intention or bureaucratic procedure. The prisoners discover they possess power that no architecture can contain, no supervision can prevent, no policy can eliminate, the power to refuse. And once that power gets demonstrated, it changes everything about the relationship between institutional authority and individual resistance. The building remains the same. The policies remain the same. The procedures remain the same. But the knowledge changes everything. The institution needs prisoners more than prisoners need the institution. Cooperation comes from choice rather than coercion, and resistance requires no organization beyond individual decision repeated collectively through mysterious coordination that no architecture can prevent or predict. The hunger strike becomes proof that the most sophisticated control system ever designed by imperial administration contains fatal flaws that human will can exploit through the simple expedient of saying no simultaneously and maintaining that refusal until institutional necessity forces institutional attention. Outside the walls, the world transforms through war, revolution, and political change that reach the Andaman Islands in delayed waves that arrive like monsoons, suddenly, violently, reshaping everything. The year 1941 brings war to the Bay of Bengal. Japanese forces advance through Southeast Asia, threatening British control over territories that seemed permanently secure. The Andaman Islands change from remote prison facility to strategic military position overnight. Military priorities supersede institutional priorities. Prison administration receives orders to prepare for potential evacuation, emergency destruction of facilities, or conversion to military use depending on strategic developments that unfold beyond local control. The cellular jail becomes military asset rather than correctional facility. Cells designed to hold political prisoners get redesigned to house prisoners of war. Guard posts designed for prisoner supervision get reinforced for military defense. The architecture of confinement transforms into architecture of warfare. Strategic location analysis reveals uncomfortable truths about institutional isolation. The same geographical features that make escape impossible also make military defense nearly hopeless. Distance from support becomes strategic vulnerability. Natural barriers become strategic limitations. Evacuation planning requires calculations that treat prisoners as military assets rather than human beings. Transport capacity, supply requirements, and security considerations determine which prisoners get moved, which get released, and which get abandoned to incoming occupying forces. Administrative records become security liabilities. Documentation of institutional operations provides evidence that enemy forces could use for propaganda purposes, war crimes accusations, or international legal proceedings. Emergency protocols call for systematic destruction of paperwork that might embarrass British administration. But document destruction creates different problems. Loss of prisoner identification, elimination of medical histories, destruction of legal documentation that proves institutional authority over individuals who might suddenly become military assets or political bargaining chips. The Japanese occupation arrives in March 1942 with military efficiency that transforms the Cellular jail into Japanese administrative facility within 72 hours. British guards disappear, British administrators evacuate, British policies get replaced by Japanese policies that serve different purposes through similar methods. The new administration discovers institutional infrastructure perfectly suited for their requirements. Cells designed to hold Indian political prisoners work equally well for holding British prisoners of war. Surveillance systems designed for colonial control adapt easily to military occupation control. Japanese officers occupy the same administrative offices, use the same guard towers, implement the same isolation procedures that characterized British operations. The building serves different masters while maintaining identical functions through architectural requirements that transcend political change. Prisoner populations change, but prisoner treatment remains consistent. Indian political prisoners get replaced by British military personnel, colonial administrators, and civilian internees whose political status shifts with changing military control over territorial boundaries. The oil mill continues operating under Japanese supervision with different personnel producing the same products through identical procedures. The grinding mechanism serves Japanese administrative needs as efficiently as it served British institutional requirements. Guard rotations continue according to schedules that accommodate new personnel while maintaining operational continuity. The tower maintains 24-hour surveillance. The corridors carry authorities' footsteps towards cells that contain different bodies serving identical functions. Supply chains adapt to serve Japanese rather than British logistical systems. But supply shortages continue creating similar scarcity management problems. Rice replaces chapati in dietary provisions. But caloric restrictions continue enforcing institutional control through systematic hunger. Medical facilities serve Japanese administrative priorities that emphasize prisoner productivity over prisoner welfare, maintaining operational continuity that suggests institutional function transcends political identity of institutional operators. The most disturbing element isn't administrative transition, but administrative continuity. The building operates identically, regardless of who controls it, serves similar purposes, regardless of political justification, produces similar human suffering, regardless of cultural context. Occupying forces implement policies that mirror previous policies so closely that institutional routine continues without interruption. Different uniforms, different languages, different political justifications, identical human results through identical administrative methods. Some guards collaborate with new administration, maintaining employment through political flexibility that prioritizes personal survival over institutional loyalty. They continue carrying keys, conducting inspections, implementing policies that serve new masters through familiar procedures. Other guards disappear into prisoner populations, experiencing institutional control from opposite perspective that teaches them what their former employment actually accomplished. The reversal of roles provides education in institutional reality that no training manual could deliver. The war ends in August 1945 with Japanese surrender that returns territorial control to British administration, but the institutional damage proves irreversible. The building remains structurally intact while its political purpose dissolves through changing imperial priorities. Post-war policy reviews determine that cellular imprisonment no longer serves British strategic interests. Political resistance movements gain international support that makes isolated institutional torture politically expensive rather than politically useful. The building that was designed to break Indian political resistance becomes political liability for British administrative legitimacy. International attention focuses on colonial prison conditions with uncomfortable intensity that makes continued operation more expensive than beneficial. Administrative personnel return to discover facility that functions perfectly while serving no useful purpose. The machine operates exactly as designed, but the political context that justified its existence has disappeared through military and diplomatic changes beyond local control. Gradual prisoner releases begin through procedures that empty cells without acknowledging institutional failure. Political prisoners receive pardons that eliminate evidence of their resistance rather than evidence of their guilt. The system protects itself through historical revisionism. Transfer protocols move remaining prisoners to mainland facilities where institutional control operates through less architecturally dramatic but equally effective administrative procedures. The building empties gradually while maintaining operational appearance until the last cell gets unlocked for the final time. But the building remains standing, empty now but intact, ready to resume operations if political circumstances require institutional resurrection. Architecture outlasts politics, waiting patiently for future justification to restore its original purpose. The war teaches difficult lessons about institutional flexibility. The same building serves British control, Japanese occupation, and eventual British restoration through architectural adaptability that suggests structure transcends ideology. The machine operates regardless of who controls it. The cellular jail proves its institutional value by serving different masters equally well, maintaining operational effectiveness regardless of political change, providing consistent results regardless of cultural context. The building succeeds by being useful rather than ideological. And in that success lies the most terrifying lesson of all. Institutional control operates through architectural and administrative mechanisms that serve any authority willing to use them. The machine doesn't care who turns it on. It just runs. The year 1920 brings a different kind of prisoner to the Andaman Islands. Men who arrive not as criminals, but as enemies of empire. Political resistors whose crimes consist of believing that Indian soil belongs to Indian people. They disembark from prison ships with their heads unbowed, their eyes meeting guard stares without flinching, their voices carrying songs that transform transport vessels into floating temples of defiance. These aren't broken men seeking rehabilitation. These are believers carrying ideology more dangerous than any weapon ever confiscated. The cellular jail was designed to process individual criminals through systematic isolation that breaks personal will through architectural pressure. But political prisoners introduce variables that Jeremy Bentham never calculated: purpose that transcends personal survival, meaning that survives physical torture, hope that multiplies rather than diminishes under institutional pressure. Mahatma Gandhi's non-cooperation movement floods British jails with thousands of volunteers who deliberately seek arrest, trial, and imprisonment as political statement. Each cell becomes a monastery where resistance gets refined rather than abandoned. Isolation becomes meditation retreat for revolutionary planning. The intake protocols remain identical, but their psychological impact changes completely. Shaving heads becomes tonsure ceremony. Numbering becomes renunciation of individual identity in service of collective cause. Uniform distribution becomes assumption of sacred garments worn by warriors of independence. Medical examinations document men whose physical health reflects lifelong preparation for suffering. Political prisoners arrive already practiced in fasting, accustomed to discomfort, trained in psychological techniques that transform punishment into spiritual exercise. Fingerprinting creates permanent records of men who want their resistance documented, preserved, remembered by future generations as evidence of anti-colonial commitment. The administrative procedures designed to erase identity instead create martyrdom certificates. Cell assignments attempt to separate political prisoners according to regional origins, religious affiliations, and organizational loyalties. But isolation that worked against individual criminals fails against collective ideology that transcends geographic and cultural boundaries. The prisoners develop communication networks that exploit architectural features designed to prevent exactly this coordination. Morse code tapped through cell walls, messages written in dust and erased before inspection. Hand signals pass through window bars during brief exercise periods. Religious observances become resistance activities that administration cannot prohibit without appearing to persecute faith traditions. Prayer schedules coordinate prisoner activities. Fasting periods disguise hunger strikes. Religious songs carry coded messages that sound like worship but function as tactical communication. Political discussion continues despite prohibition against conversation. Prisoners conduct silent seminars through gesture, facial expression, and shared reading of religious texts that contain double meanings accessible to initiated readers but invisible to administrative oversight. The building fills beyond design capacity as political arrests multiply faster than administrative processing can handle. Cells designed for single-occupancy house 2 prisoners. Corridors designed for individual isolation accommodate group gatherings during medical emergencies and maintenance activities. Overcrowding creates sanitation crises that overwhelm infrastructure designed for smaller populations under controlled conditions. The drainage systems back up. The water supply becomes inadequate. The waste removal protocols break down under volume pressure that exceeds engineering specifications. Food distribution becomes mathematical impossibility as kitchen facilities struggle to provide adequate nutrition for populations that fluctuate unpredictably based on mainland political developments beyond local administrative control. Guard ratios become dangerously low as prisoner populations swell while personnel resources remain static. Security protocols designed for specific prisoner-to-guard proportions fail when those proportions shift dramatically in favor of prisoner numbers. Medical facilities designed to serve 500 prisoners attempt to provide health care for 800 prisoners whose political commitment includes willingness to sacrifice physical health for ideological objectives that administrative personnel don't understand. The most dangerous element isn't numerical, it's psychological. Political prisoners possess something that criminal prisoners lack: unshakable belief that their suffering serves larger purposes that justify present discomfort in exchange for future freedom. They transform punishment into education, isolation into contemplation, deprivation into spiritual exercise. The institutional mechanisms designed to break individual will become training devices that strengthen collective resolve through shared experience of systematic oppression. Prison routines become religious observances. Work assignments become opportunities for quiet conversation. Meal periods become communion ceremonies that reinforce political solidarity through ritualized sharing of institutional food. The guards discover they're supervising men who want to be exactly where they are, doing exactly what they're doing, suffering exactly what they're suffering as deliberate political choice rather than legal consequence. Administrative reports document behavioral patterns that suggest institutional control methods produce opposite results when applied to populations motivated by ideological conviction rather than criminal intent. The system designed to punish criminals begins rewarding political commitment. Yet the institution adapts through escalated control measures designed to restore administrative authority over populations that threaten institutional legitimacy through organized noncompliance with basic operational requirements. Enhanced isolation procedures place political leaders in individual cells specifically designed to prevent communication with other prisoners. These cells receive reduced light, restricted exercise privileges, and elimination of all materials that might facilitate message composition or transmission. Extended work hours attempt to exhaust prisoners physically to levels that prevent energy expenditure on political activities. The oil mill operates 16 hours daily instead of 8, with political prisoners assigned to rotating shifts that eliminate rest periods. Medical restrictions disguise punishment as healthcare policy. Political prisoners receive minimal medical attention justified through regulations that classify resistance activities as mental health disorders requiring institutional intervention rather than medical treatment. Dietary modifications reduce food quality and quantity for prisoners identified as political organizers. The reductions get disguised as nutritional management for populations whose ideology allegedly creates eating disorders requiring medical supervision. Communication prohibitions extend beyond conversation to include eye contact, gesture, and shared physical space during exercise periods. Political prisoners receive individual exercise schedules that eliminate opportunities for coordinated activities or group planning, but each escalation produces counter-adaptations that prove political commitment grows stronger under increased pressure. Enhanced isolation creates martyrdom that inspires other prisoners. Extended work hours become endurance competitions that build solidarity. Medical restrictions generate sympathy that increases political support. The institutional response teaches political prisoners valuable lessons about imperial psychology, administrative weakness, and systematic vulnerabilities that they incorporate into resistance strategies with increasingly sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. Underground networks develop that operate parallel to official administrative systems. Prisoners establish informal leadership structures, communication protocols, resource distribution systems, and mutual support networks that function independently of institutional oversight. Information flows through these networks faster and more accurately than through official channels. Prisoners know about policy changes, personnel transfers, and administrative decisions before guards receive official notification through bureaucratic procedures. Medical emergencies become opportunities for group coordination as prisoners assist each other through crises that overwhelm inadequate institutional healthcare systems. Political solidarity creates healthcare networks that supplement official medical services. Educational activities continue despite prohibitions against intellectual engagement. Prisoners conduct classes in languages, history, political theory, and religious studies using memory-based instruction that requires no written materials or physical resources. Legal coordination develops as prisoners with legal training provide assistance to other prisoners navigating administrative procedures, appeals processes, and family communication systems that operate through restricted official channels. The most significant development is transformation of individual imprisonment into collective experience that strengthens, rather than weakens, political commitment through shared suffering that becomes shared purpose. Prisoners begin viewing their sentences not as punishment to be endured but as service to be completed in preparation for continued resistance activities after release. The cellular jail becomes training facility for future political leadership. They study institutional psychology through daily observation of administrative behavior, guard psychology, and systematic operational patterns that reveal imperial control mechanisms with clarity impossible to achieve outside controlled institutional environments. The building designed to eliminate political resistance becomes University for Political Education, where curriculum consists of direct experience with colonial oppression, administered through architectural and bureaucratic systems that students will later oppose through informed strategy. And then comes the incident that transforms institutional crisis into political emergency, an assault, an unjust punishment, a death that cannot be hidden through administrative paperwork or bureaucratic misdirection. The specific details matter less than the systemic response. Administration chooses escalation over investigation, punishment over accountability, control over justice. The decision transforms institutional problem into political scandal, with implications that extend far beyond prison walls. The hunger strike that follows dwarfs all previous resistance efforts in scope, coordination, and political sophistication. It begins not with announcement or declaration but with systematic coordination that demonstrates political organization capabilities that administrative surveillance failed to detect or prevent. On March 15, 1921, breakfast remains untouched in every cell containing political prisoners. The coordination extends beyond the cellular jail to include political prisoners in mainland facilities, creating simultaneous hunger strikes across multiple institutions, that transform local administrative problem into imperial crisis, requiring attention from colonial government highest levels. The prisoners make specific demands: investigation of prisoner deaths, removal of administrative personnel responsible for policy violations, improvement of medical facilities, restoration of communication privileges, and recognition of political prisoner status separate from criminal prisoner classification. Administrative response follows established protocols designed for individual hunger strikes rather than coordinated political actions. Medical personnel attempt force-feeding procedures on prisoners who resist through organized non-cooperation that overwhelms institutional resources. Force-feeding 800 determined political prisoners requires medical staff, equipment, and security personnel that the institution doesn't possess. The procedures break down into chaotic struggles that produce injuries requiring additional medical attention that further strains inadequate healthcare systems. Documentary evidence accumulates as medical staff document force-feeding procedures through required reports that create permanent records of institutional torture disguised as medical intervention. The paperwork becomes evidence that administrative personnel cannot later deny or destroy. Media attention arrives through networks that political prisoners maintain with outside supporters, despite communication restrictions. News of hunger strikes reaches mainland newspapers, international observers, and political organizations that publicize institutional conditions. Medical monitoring reveals systematic deterioration in prisoner health that approaches critical thresholds requiring emergency intervention. Prisoners lose weight at rates that indicate approaching organ failure within timelines that create political pressure for administrative response. Weight loss charts become daily documentation of institutional crisis as administrative personnel track prisoner deterioration toward potential mortality that would create international scandal requiring official explanation and accountability. International pressure mounts through religious organizations, legal societies, and political groups that recognize hunger strikes as legitimate resistance activities deserving support rather than suppression through medical coercion. Political leaders on mainland India coordinate public support for prisoner demands through demonstrations, speeches, and media campaigns that transform isolated institutional crisis into national political movement with international attention. The administration faces impossible choice between allowing prisoner deaths that would create permanent political scandal and meeting prisoner demands that would acknowledge administrative failure requiring policy changes with broader implications for colonial control systems. Days pass with deteriorating prisoner health, documented through medical reports that provide evidence of systematic institutional torture administered through deliberate withholding of medical assistance to striking prisoners. Families receive notification of prisoner health crises through medical communications that cannot disguise severity of situations created through administrative choice to continue force-feeding procedures rather than negotiate political resolution. Legal observers arrive through court orders requiring institutional access for independent medical evaluation of prisoner conditions under circumstances that threaten immediate mortality, requiring emergency intervention. International medical societies express concern about force-feeding procedures that violate professional medical ethics through coercive treatment designed to break political resistance rather than provide therapeutic health care. The hunger strike succeeds not through institutional concession, but through political pressure that forces colonial government intervention in institutional operations. Orders arrive from Calcutta directing immediate policy changes, administrative transfers, and procedural modifications. Investigation committees get appointed to examine prisoner allegations, administrative practices, and institutional conditions, with authority to recommend personnel changes and policy modifications based on evidence of systematic violations of colonial legal standards. Medical facilities receive additional resources, personnel, and equipment designed to provide health care adequate for political prisoner populations whose treatment becomes measure of colonial government commitment to legal procedures. Communication privileges get restored through policies that acknowledge political prisoner status while maintaining security restrictions that balance institutional control requirements with political pressure for humanitarian treatment. Administrative personnel receive transfers to other positions as colonial government distances itself from institutional policies that create political embarrassment requiring official disavowal and personnel accountability. The prisoners resume eating after receiving written confirmation of policy changes, administrative transfers, and investigation procedures that address their specific demands through official channels that create permanent administrative records. Victory celebration takes form of coordinated prayer services that transform individual cells into unified religious observance that demonstrates organizational capabilities that survived intensive institutional pressure designed to eliminate collective resistance. But the hunger strike's real success lies not in specific concessions, but in demonstration of political power that transcends institutional control, organizational capability that survives administrative pressure, and collective will that strengthens rather than weakens under systematic oppression. The institutional machine designed to process individual resistance through architectural isolation proves inadequate for managing collective resistance organized through political ideology that transforms punishment into training, isolation into education, and suffering into strength. Political prisoners discover they possess power that no building can contain, the power to transform institutional torture into political education, administrative oppression into organizational experience, and systematic punishment into systematic preparation for continued resistance. The cellular jail remains the same building, but its function changes completely. Instead of breaking political resistance, it creates political leadership. Instead of eliminating opposition, it educates opposition. Instead of processing criminals, it graduates revolutionaries. And with monsoon season approaching, nature itself prepares to test institutional systems already strained beyond design capacity by human resistance that architectural engineering never anticipated. June brings the southwest monsoon with meteorological violence that transforms the Bay of Bengal into liquid chaos. Rain arrives not as weather, but as assault, water delivered at velocity and volume that overwhelms any human attempt at control or preparation. The first warning signs appear as atmospheric pressure drops, wind patterns shift, and humidity rises to levels that make breathing feel like drowning. The air itself becomes enemy combatant in alliance with water against human habitation. The building that seemed permanent and solid reveals itself as temporary construction, vulnerable to environmental forces that operate on scales that dwarf human engineering pretensions. Every joint leaks, every seal fails. Every supposedly waterproof surface becomes pathway for water invasion. Roof systems designed for moderate tropical rainfall prove inadequate for monsoon volumes that deliver 30 inches of water in 72 hours. The gutters overflow immediately. The drainage systems back up within hours. The courtyards become lakes that rise toward cell door levels. Corridors that echoed with authorities' footsteps become rivers that carry institutional authority downstream, along with furniture, paperwork, and administrative pretensions to environmental control. Cell blocks that maintained perfect temperature control through careful ventilation design become sweat boxes as humidity rises to 98% and air circulation systems clog with water. Debris and tropical vegetation torn loose by wind velocities that exceed architectural specifications. The tower that provided perfect surveillance over 7 wings becomes lighthouse blind in weather that reduces visibility to arm's length. Guards can no longer observe prisoners because guards can no longer observe anything beyond immediate physical proximity. Metal components that survive tropical heat begin screaming protests as moisture invades every joint, every bearing, every mechanism designed to operate in controlled environmental conditions. Rust spreads like cancer through iron bars, steel hinges, and brass fittings. Lock mechanisms seize as water penetrates keyholes, bolt housings, and spring assemblies calibrated for dry operation. Guards discover they cannot secure cells properly because security systems fail under environmental conditions that occur annually with predictable regularity. Window systems that provided controlled light and ventilation become water delivery devices as wind-driven rain penetrates every seal, gasket, and supposedly secure barrier between inside and outside environmental conditions. Electrical systems that powered surveillance equipment, communication devices, and lighting systems fail systematically as moisture invades wiring, switches, and junction boxes designed by engineers who never experienced tropical storm conditions. Emergency lighting operates on battery systems that lose charge faster in high humidity, while demand increases due to reduced daylight penetration through storm clouds that block sun for days at a time. Food storage systems that maintained adequate nutrition for prisoner populations fail as rising water contaminates grain supplies, ruins preserved foods, and creates conditions that promote rapid spoilage of perishable materials. Kitchen facilities flood as drainage systems back up, carrying sewage into food preparation areas that become unusable for sanitary food production. Meal provision becomes emergency management, requiring improvised solutions under impossible conditions. Medical facilities that provided minimal health care for prisoner populations become inaccessible as corridors flood and equipment gets damaged by water exposure. Medical emergencies occur during exactly the period when medical response becomes impossible. Communication systems that connected the institution to mainland support fail as radio equipment shorts out and telephone lines get severed by falling trees. The prison becomes completely isolated during exactly the period when coordination with outside assistance becomes most necessary. Supply deliveries that provided basic necessities stop completely as ships cannot safely approach harbor facilities during storm conditions. The institution becomes self-sufficient exactly when self-sufficiency becomes impossible due to infrastructure failures. Personnel quarters that housed guards and administrative staff flood as badly as prisoner cells, creating a situation where institutional authority suffers under identical environmental conditions as institutional subjects. The hierarchy collapses into shared misery. Administrative offices that maintained detailed records of prisoner control become underwater storage areas, where paperwork dissolves into pulp and filing systems become aquariums, containing floating documents that document nothing. Yet prisoners adapt to emergency conditions faster than administrative personnel, because prisoners possess fewer possessions to lose, fewer comfort expectations to disappoint, and more experience with systematic deprivation under adverse conditions. Survival skills that developed through institutional oppression transfer effectively to environmental emergency management. Prisoners understand resource conservation, discomfort tolerance, and cooperative problem-solving under pressure. Water collection becomes prisoner expertise as men accustomed to controlled water rations efficiently gather, store, and distribute rainwater using improvised containers and distribution systems that supplement failed institutional water supplies. Food preservation techniques learned during hunger strikes help prisoners maintain nutrition using emergency rations and improvised cooking methods that operate despite kitchen facility failures and supply distribution breakdowns. Cooperative networks that developed during political resistance adapt quickly to emergency mutual aid that helps prisoners survive environmental crisis through resource sharing and collective problem solving. Medical knowledge that accumulated through self-treatment of injuries and illnesses helps prisoners provide health care for emergency conditions when institutional medical facilities become inaccessible due to flooding and equipment failures. The most significant development is role reversal between prisoners and guards, as environmental crisis creates conditions where prisoner adaptation skills become more valuable than administrative authority. Guards who maintained control through institutional position discover that institutional position provides no protection against environmental assault that affects everyone equally regardless of uniform or status. Prisoners who possessed useful knowledge about emergency survival, resource conservation, and cooperative problem-solving under pressure become informal leaders whose expertise proves more valuable than official authority. The building surveillance systems that maintained perfect institutional control become useless furniture as visibility drops to zero and communication systems fail completely. Authority depends on observation, and observation becomes impossible. Sound-based control that relied on architectural acoustics fails as storm noise drowns out human voices, mechanical signals, and auditory surveillance systems. The building loses its ability to hear what happens within its own walls. During 3 days of peak storm intensity, institutional control collapses into survival cooperation as guards and prisoners work together to prevent building collapse, maintain basic safety, and provide mutual assistance under conditions that threaten everyone equally. When wind velocity reaches levels that threaten structural integrity, traditional hierarchies become irrelevant as immediate physical survival requires all available human resources regardless of institutional status or administrative classification. Emergency repairs require prisoner labor, guard supervision, and cooperative planning that temporarily suspends normal institutional relationships in favor of collaborative problem-solving under environmental pressure that affects everyone identically. The storm teaches lessons about institutional vulnerability that no political resistance could demonstrate as clearly. Environmental forces respect no human authority, acknowledge no administrative hierarchy, and defeat institutional control through superior power applied without regard for human organizational systems. Yet when storm conditions subside and institutional personnel attempt to restore normal operations, they discover that temporary cooperation has permanently altered institutional relationships in ways that no administrative directive can reverse. Prisoners who provided emergency leadership during crisis cannot be easily returned to status as passive institutional subjects. Guards who received assistance from prisoners cannot easily resume previous attitudes of complete authority over populations that proved more capable during emergency conditions. The building that emerged from storm damage requires repairs that demand continued cooperation, resource sharing, and collaborative problem-solving that maintains emergency relationship dynamics within supposedly normal operational frameworks. And in the chaos of rain and rising water, something else happens that transforms institutional crisis into permanent institutional change. Plans form, messages move, and prisoners discover that surveillance failure creates opportunities that careful planning can exploit. The storm provides cover not just for survival activities, but for resistance activities that take advantage of communication failures, transportation disruptions, and administrative confusion that creates windows of opportunity for organized action. When the wind finally stops howling and the water finally recedes, institutional personnel conducting damage assessment discover that more than buildings have been changed by the storm. The human relationships that maintain institutional control have shifted in ways that no reconstruction can restore to previous configuration. The night that changes everything arrives without warning or dramatic buildup, just the convergence of environmental opportunity, human preparation, and institutional vulnerability in combinations that transform theoretical possibility into practical reality. The monsoon has ended, but its effects linger in damaged systems that require constant maintenance, temporary repairs that create new vulnerabilities, and administrative disruptions that provide cover for activities that normal surveillance would detect immediately. At 11:47 on September 23rd, emergency alarms begin ringing throughout the Cellular jail as guards discover that institutional control has collapsed not gradually but suddenly, completely, catastrophically. The specific details vary, depending on which official report gets consulted, but the pattern remains consistent across all accounts. Coordinated action, precise timing, and exploitation of systematic vulnerabilities that institutional security could not prevent despite elaborate surveillance systems. 23 prisoners from different wings, different political backgrounds, and different administrative classifications somehow coordinate simultaneous action that overwhelms security protocols designed to handle individual resistance or small group coordination. Lock mechanisms damaged during monsoon flooding fail at precisely the moments when guards attempt to secure cells during routine evening procedures. Water damage that seemed like environmental accident reveals itself as environmental opportunity exploited through careful planning. Key control systems that operated smoothly under normal conditions break down when storm-damaged communication equipment prevents rapid response to security alerts. Guards cannot coordinate response when coordination systems don't function. Emergency lighting fails exactly when backup systems would normally activate, creating darkness that provides cover for movement while eliminating visibility that surveillance requires. The timing suggests intimate knowledge of electrical system vulnerabilities, Alarm systems that should summon immediate assistance produce no response because communication lines severed during storm repairs haven't been completely restored. Help cannot be summoned when summoning systems don't operate. Guard rotation schedules that normally provide adequate coverage become inadequate when personnel shortages created by storm-related injuries coincide with peak security demands during emergency conditions. The central tower that provided omniscient observation becomes isolated observation post when corridor flooding makes movement between wings impossible without wading through water that could conceal weapons, tools, or coordinated resistance activities. What begins as coordinated resistance escalates into violent confrontation when institutional response follows escalation protocols designed for normal conditions rather than emergency conditions complicated by infrastructure failures and personnel limitations. Guards armed with standard institutional weapons discover that standard weapons provide inadequate protection when outnumbered by prisoners who possess intimate knowledge of building systems, security procedures, and personnel patterns acquired through years of careful observation. Reinforcement procedures that depend on rapid communication and transportation fail when communication systems remain unreliable and transportation routes remain compromised by storm damage that hasn't been completely repaired. The situation deteriorates rapidly as initial coordination success encourages expanded resistance activities that spread beyond original planning into spontaneous actions that exceed organizational control by participants or institutional control by administrators. Violence erupts not as planned resistance activity, but as unplanned consequence of successful resistance that creates conditions where confrontation becomes inevitable, regardless of original intentions by resistance organizers or administrative personnel. Weapons appear that suggest systematic preparation. Improvised tools that exploit maintenance requirements for access to metal implements, sharp objects, and potential weapons disguised as legitimate institutional equipment. The most terrifying element for administrative personnel is demonstration that prisoner coordination operated effectively despite surveillance designed to prevent exactly this type of organization. The security system failed to detect preparation for activities it was specifically designed to prevent. Medical emergencies multiply faster than medical response capabilities as injuries occur simultaneously across multiple locations, while medical facilities remain compromised by storm damage and personnel shortages that limit emergency response capacity. Documentation systems that normally provide detailed incident reports fail when administrative personnel focus on crisis management rather than paperwork completion. Official records become incomplete exactly when complete records become most important for subsequent investigation. Communications with mainland authorities remain unreliable, preventing accurate situation reports and delaying assistance that might restore institutional control before resistance activities expand beyond manageable limits. The crisis reaches peak intensity when institutional authority recognizes that standard containment procedures cannot restore control under conditions where infrastructure failures compound human resistance to create systematic breakdown of institutional order. Emergency protocols designed for external threats prove inadequate for internal threats that exploit infrastructure weaknesses, personnel limitations, and systematic vulnerabilities that normal operations could manage, but emergency conditions cannot contain. Hours pass with situation reports that document progressive loss of institutional control over populations that demonstrate organizational capabilities and systematic knowledge that surveillance systems failed to detect during monitoring periods. When morning arrives, institutional personnel conducting damage assessment discover casualties, missing persons, and evidence of systematic planning that transformed routine institutional evening into permanent institutional trauma. The human cost includes personnel injuries, prisoner injuries, and disappearances that create accountability problems requiring official investigation and administrative response that will affect institutional operations permanently. More seriously, the incident creates evidence that institutional control depends on prisoner cooperation more than administrative authority. Surveillance effectiveness depends on prisoner compliance more than architectural design, and institutional security requires prisoner acceptance more than personnel capability. The building remains structurally intact, but institutional relationships have changed permanently. Authority that depended on demonstration of invulnerability cannot survive demonstration of systematic vulnerability under conditions that could recur whenever environmental and human factors combine favorably for resistance activities. Administrative personnel discover they cannot restore institutional normalcy through policy directives when institutional credibility has been damaged through public demonstration that administrative control can fail completely under predictable conditions. The investigation that follows will consume months of administrative attention while producing recommendations that cannot eliminate systematic vulnerabilities that successful resistance demonstrated exist within institutional design and operational procedures. But the immediate crisis creates different problems that demand immediate solutions. How to explain institutional failure to authorities who assumed institutional success. How to restore control over populations that have discovered institutional weakness. And how to prevent information about institutional vulnerability from spreading beyond institutional boundaries. The night the system stumbled becomes the night everything changed, because once institutional invulnerability gets challenged successfully, the psychology that maintains institutional control can never be completely restored to previous effectiveness. The machine continues operating, but everyone knows it can break. And that knowledge changes everything about how the machine operates and how its subjects respond to its operation. The administrative orders arrive by telegraph on a Tuesday morning in 1937, typed on official letterhead that carries the weight of imperial decision rendered in bureaucratic language designed to disguise the magnitude of institutional failure. Cellular jail operations will be systematically reduced in accordance with revised colonial correctional policies effective immediately. Prisoner transfer protocols commence October 1st. Administrative staff reassignments follow standard imperial service procedures. Facility decommission timeline extends through December 31st. The language is clinical, administrative, sanitized of human consequence. But between the typed lines, a different story emerges. The story of institutional defeat disguised as policy evolution. Systematic failure rebranded as strategic reorganization. The cellular jail is closing not because it served its purpose, but because it failed to serve any useful purpose that justified its continued operational expense. Political resistance proved stronger than architectural control. International embarrassment exceeded administrative benefit. The machine designed to break human will discovered that human will, properly organized, could break machines. Prisoner transfers begin with systematic efficiency that mirrors original intake procedures, but operates in reverse. Numbers become names again. Uniforms return to personal clothing. Administrative inventory transforms back into human identity through bureaucratic procedures designed to eliminate evidence of institutional processing. The most dangerous prisoners, political leaders whose resistance proved most effective, receive transfers to mainland facilities where traditional institutional methods might prove more successful than architectural experimentation. The cellular jail exports its failures to other institutions that inherit problems they didn't create. Lesser political prisoners receive outright release through pardons that eliminate legal evidence of their resistance rather than legal evidence of their guilt. The administration protects itself through historical revisionism that transforms institutional failure into administrative mercy. Criminal prisoners receive transfers to conventional jails where traditional security measures replace architectural innovation. They carry with them knowledge of resistance techniques learned during political prisoner coordination that will influence institutional operations in facilities never designed to handle educated resistance. The guards face reassignment decisions that will scatter institutional knowledge across imperial service networks. Some receive promotions that reward loyalty during institutional crisis. Others receive lateral transfers that acknowledge service while preventing accumulation of uncomfortable institutional memory in single administrative location. Administrative personnel document transfer procedures through reports that will become historical records of institutional closure without acknowledging historical reasons for institutional closure. The paperwork protects bureaucratic reputation while eliminating bureaucratic responsibility. Medical staff complete final health assessments that document prisoner physical condition at transfer time creating medical records that establish institutional healthcare standards without acknowledging institutional healthcare failures that required external intervention. Kitchen facilities complete final meal service using remaining supplies distributed according to protocols that maintain routine until routine no longer serves any institutional purpose. The last meals taste exactly like the first meals. Institutional efficiency flavored with controlled deprivation. Maintenance crews begin shutdown procedures that reverse construction processes through systematic dismantling of infrastructure designed for permanent operation. Water systems get drained. Electrical systems get disconnected. Security systems get deactivated through procedures that acknowledge their previous failure. The oil mill completes final operations with prisoner labor that produces oil to light lamps during final weeks of institutional operation. The irony is perfect and unacknowledged. Prisoners power their own liberation through labor that maintains institutional function until institutional function becomes unnecessary. Keys get collected, counted, cataloged, and stored in administrative archives that preserve evidence of systematic control while eliminating populations that systematic control failed to control. The sound of key collection echoes through empty corridors like mechanical death rattles. Cell inspections continue until the last prisoner departs, maintaining institutional routine through final moments of institutional existence. Guards perform duties that serve no purpose other than demonstrating institutional commitment to procedural consistency, regardless of practical necessity. The tower maintains 24-hour watch over populations that shrink daily until tower watch becomes solitary vigil over empty architecture. The lantern burns through final nights, illuminating nothing while marking time until time marking becomes meaningless. On December 31, 1937, the cellular jail completes its final day of operation with sunset inspection of empty cells, administrative closure of empty offices, and ceremonial extinguishing of tower lantern that burned continuously for 79 years, 4 months, and 21 days. The building falls silent for the first time since construction completion. No footsteps in corridors, no keys in locks, no voices in cells, no machinery grinding, no administrative activity, just silence that feels different from institutional silence, abandonment, silence that suggests permanence rather than temporary control. But buildings don't disappear simply because human activity stops. Architecture outlasts administration, stone endures longer than policy, steel rusts slower than institutional memory fades. The cellular jail remains standing, empty but intact, waiting for new purposes that may never arrive. The silence contains echoes of 79 years of human processing, systematic suffering, and architectural control that operated according to imperial logic that seemed permanent until it proved temporary. The building remembers what its inhabitants prefer to forget. Security protocols end with ceremonial lock installation on main gates that will remain unopened for decades. The locks protect nothing because nothing remains to protect, but they maintain administrative fiction that closure represents security rather than surrender. The last administrative report documents facility closure through language that treats institutional failure as administrative success. Cellular jail operations concluded successfully in accordance with revised imperial correctional policies. All prisoners transferred safely, all personnel reassigned appropriately, all equipment secured properly. Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. The phrase hangs in tropical air heavy with humidity and historical irony. What mission? Accomplished how? The questions receive no answers, because answers would require acknowledgement that original mission failed completely through resistance that architectural innovation could not prevent or contain. The building stands empty, but emptiness feels different from abandonment. Abandonment suggests temporary absence. This feels permanent, final, conclusive. The cellular jail has become monument to its own failure, architectural testimony to human resistance that proved stronger than institutional control. Yet the building remains structurally sound, mechanically functional, administratively ready for reactivation if political circumstances should require institutional resurrection. The machine is switched off, not broken. Sleeping, not dead. And in that readiness lies the most disturbing element of institutional closure. The knowledge that architectural capacity for systematic human processing survives institutional decision to stop processing humans. The building waits patiently for justification to resume operations that proved politically impossible but remain architecturally feasible. The wind begins its work immediately, carrying salt spray from the Bay of Bengal into corridors designed to contain human breath, but unable to exclude atmospheric intrusion that operates according to physical laws indifferent to architectural intention. Within weeks, the first signs of environmental reclamation appear as tropical vegetation probes for weaknesses in human construction that maintained perfect control over human populations, but cannot maintain equivalent control over plant growth that follows no administrative protocols. Vines penetrate window seals with patient persistence that makes human resistance seem impulsive by comparison. Roots explore foundation cracks with systematic thoroughness that architectural engineers never anticipated. Insects establish colonies in spaces designed for human occupation, but abandoned to environmental occupation. The monsoon arrives in June, as always, but without human activity to resist its environmental assault. Water penetrates every seal, floods every drain, overwhelms every barrier designed to exclude natural forces from artificial spaces. The building begins its slow surrender to climate. Rust spreads through metalwork with chemical precision that transforms security devices into decorative remnants of institutional purpose. Iron bars corrode, steel hinges seize. Brass fittings tarnish into archaeological artifacts of systematic control that no longer controls anything. Mold colonizes surfaces with biological efficiency that converts architectural spaces into ecological habitats. Cell walls become growth medium for fungal networks that respect no administrative boundaries, acknowledge no institutional hierarchy, follow no human schedule except seasonal moisture availability. The roof systems that protected institutional operations from environmental interference fail systematically as water penetrates through gaps that expand with temperature changes, wind pressure, and simple entropy that operates at geological rather than administrative timescales. Electrical systems that powered surveillance equipment, communication devices, and lighting systems become habitats for small animals that nest in junction boxes, gnaw insulation, and create biological short circuits that eliminate technological capability through organic intervention. Plumbing systems that managed human waste with sanitary precision become highways for creatures that explore abandoned infrastructure according to biological rather than bureaucratic logic. The building's circulatory system serves new populations that administrative designers never considered. Stone surfaces that seemed permanent reveal themselves as temporary constructions vulnerable to chemical weathering that operates with patient persistence measured in decades rather than administrative quarters. Limestone dissolves slowly but constantly in tropical humidity. Mortar joints that held architectural precision together for human purposes deteriorate through natural processes that restore construction materials to geological rather than architectural configuration. The building deconstructs itself through chemical processes that human engineering temporarily delayed but could not permanently prevent. Glass windows that provided controlled transparency crack, shatter, and disappear into fragments that become garden ornaments for vegetation that colonizes interior spaces designed for human habitation but now available for environmental occupation. Wooden elements that survive tropical assault during active maintenance periods surrender quickly to insect attack, fungal infection, and simple rot that operates according to biological rather than bureaucratic schedules. Doors warp, sag, and collapse into decomposing barriers that exclude nothing. The tower that provided omniscient surveillance becomes perch for birds that establish territorial control over architectural spaces through biological rather than administrative authority. Their droppings create new erosion patterns that accelerate structural deterioration. Yet the most remarkable element isn't environmental assault, but environmental adaptation. The building doesn't fight natural reclamation, it accommodates environmental occupation through passive acceptance that suggests architectural relief at abandoning institutional purpose for ecological function. Corridors designed to amplify authorities' footsteps carry wind sounds, bird calls, and rainfall with acoustic properties that seem designed for natural rather than artificial sound transmission. The architecture serves environmental purposes more successfully than it served institutional purposes. Cells designed for human isolation become perfect habitats for creatures that require protected spaces but don't require systematic oppression. The architectural precision that created human suffering creates ecological success through application of identical design principles to different populations. The central courtyard that hosted oil mill operations becomes garden space that supports plant communities with greater diversity and biological success than it ever supported human communities. The space serves life more effectively without systematic control than it served institutional purposes with systematic control. Drainage systems that managed human waste with bureaucratic precision provide irrigation for botanical communities that thrive in spaces designed for human suffering. The building's waste management serves ecological rather than institutional purposes. Light penetration that was carefully controlled for institutional surveillance provides illumination for photosynthetic processes that convert atmospheric carbon into biological growth that fills architectural spaces with living abundance rather than systematic emptiness. The building reveals itself as more successful as ecological habitat than it ever was as institutional machine. Environmental occupation succeeds where institutional control failed. Natural processes accomplish what administrative procedures could not achieve, and biological communities thrive in spaces where human communities suffered. Within 5 years, the cellular jail looks like ruins of ancient civilization rather than recent institutional construction. Nature operates faster than human memory. Biological reclamation proceeds more efficiently than historical preservation, and environmental restoration eliminates evidence of institutional operation with thoroughness that administrative cover-ups never achieved. Visitors who encounter the building without historical knowledge might conclude they are exploring archaeological remains of vanished society rather than recent artifacts of imperial administration. The building disguises its own recent past through environmental camouflage that conceals institutional history beneath botanical present. But beneath vines, mold, rust, and decay, the architectural structure remains sound. The fundamental engineering that created systematic human processing capacity survives environmental assault that eliminates superficial evidence of systematic human processing operations. The machine sleeps beneath garden, waiting. And that patience contains the most disturbing element of architectural decay, the knowledge that environmental reclamation masks rather than eliminates institutional capability. The building can be cleared, restored, and reactivated whenever political circumstances justify institutional resurrection. Nature provides temporary disguise for permanent institutional capacity that waits beneath botanical camouflage for justification to resume operations that proved politically impossible but remain architecturally feasible. The machine dreams of systematic control while wearing flowers. The first demolition orders arrive in 1952, as administrative efficiency experts recommend facility removal to eliminate maintenance costs, security risks, and historical embarrassment that abandoned institutional architecture creates for post-independence political legitimacy. The recommendations follow administrative logic that treats buildings as budgetary line items rather than historical artifacts. Cellular jail demolition will eliminate ongoing maintenance expenses while providing construction materials for beneficial public projects. Site clearance creates development opportunities for economically productive activities. But demolition planning reveals practical complexities that administrative recommendations didn't anticipate. The building was designed for permanence, constructed with materials and techniques that resist environmental assault and, by extension, resist systematic removal through mechanical demolition. Structural engineering analysis documents construction quality that exceeded contemporary building standards by margins that make demolition more expensive than restoration. The walls are too thick, the foundations too deep, the materials too durable for economical removal through conventional demolition techniques. Partial demolition begins with removal of 3 wings through procedures that demonstrate the extraordinary cost and complexity of eliminating architecture designed for permanent institutional operation. Each wing requires months of work and specialized equipment that costs more than original construction. Demolition crews discover construction techniques that utilized materials, methods, and engineering principles designed to resist not only environmental assault, but human assault from populations determined to escape institutional control. The building was designed to resist exactly the type of systematic destruction that demolition requires. Hidden reinforcement systems, unexpected foundation depths, and structural integration between architectural elements create demolition challenges that exceed budgetary projections by margins that force reconsideration of complete facility removal. The remaining 4 wings survive demolition planning through combination of practical expense and emerging historical interest that begins treating architectural remnants as monuments rather than maintenance liabilities. Archaeological investigation during demolition activities discovers construction artifacts that document building methods, worker conditions, and material sources that provide historical evidence of imperial construction practices with value beyond administrative cost-benefit analysis. Historical preservation advocates argue that cellular jail remnants constitute irreplaceable architectural documentation of colonial control methods that deserve preservation as educational rather than commemorative monuments to systematic institutional oppression. Political considerations complicate preservation arguments as post-independence governments struggle with questions about appropriate relationships between historical preservation and historical trauma, architectural documentation, and institutional glorification. The partial demolition creates architectural hybrid, incomplete destruction that eliminates some evidence of institutional operation while preserving other evidence through selective preservation that acknowledges historical significance while limiting historical scope. 3 demolished wings leave foundation remnants that mark original architectural footprint without preserving architectural detail. Visitors can understand building scale without experiencing architectural impact, historical scope without psychological effect. 4 surviving wings provide architectural documentation of institutional design while limiting visitor experience to manageable psychological impact. The preservation maintains historical evidence while preventing historical trauma through controlled exposure to institutional architecture. The demolition creates monument through destruction rather than preservation, memorial that acknowledges institutional history while eliminating institutional capacity, historical recognition that prevents historical repetition through architectural inability to repeat institutional operations. But selective demolition also creates historical editing that eliminates evidence of institutional operation scale, while preserving evidence of institutional design. Future visitors will understand institutional theory without experiencing institutional practice, architectural intention without architectural impact. The demolished sections disappear into construction materials that build schools, hospitals, and public buildings throughout Port Blair. Institutional architecture recycled into beneficial infrastructure that serves community development rather than community oppression. Foundation stones that supported systematic human processing become foundation stones for systematic human education. Iron bars that confine political prisoners become reinforcement for buildings that house democratic institutions. The materials serve liberation through recycling, yet recycling also eliminates evidence. Construction materials that document institutional operations disappear into infrastructure that serves different purposes without acknowledging material history that connects beneficial present construction to oppressive past operations. The cellular jail becomes memory through forgetting, monument through erasure, historical preservation through historical elimination. The building survives as partial reminder of complete institutional operation that cannot be completely remembered because it cannot be completely experienced. Visitors will understand that systematic oppression occurred without understanding how systematic oppression operated, acknowledge institutional horror without experiencing institutional impact, recognize historical trauma without feeling historical trauma. The demolition succeeds in eliminating institutional capacity while preserving institutional memory, but only partial memory that eliminates psychological impact that made institutional operations effective. The monument preserves history while eliminating historical power, and in that elimination lies both success and failure of historical preservation. The building teaches about systematic oppression without demonstrating systematic oppression, documents institutional horror without creating institutional horror, preserves historical memory while eliminating historical impact. The machinery of institutional control becomes museum exhibit through architectural taxidermy that maintains appearance while eliminating function, historical form while preventing historical effect. The transformation from active prison to passive monument begins with administrative decision to convert remaining cellular jail architecture into national memorial that acknowledges colonial oppression while serving educational rather than operational purposes. The conversion requires architectural modifications that maintain historical authenticity while ensuring visitor safety, historical accuracy while preventing psychological trauma, educational value while eliminating operational capability. Original cell doors receive modification that allows tourist entry and exit while preventing tourist confinement. Historical authenticity requires functional demonstration, but educational purpose requires safety assurance that eliminates authentic historical experience. Security systems get converted into educational displays that explain panopticon principles while demonstrating surveillance theory without implementing surveillance practice. Visitors learn about institutional control without experiencing institutional control. Corridor acoustics that amplified authorities' footsteps and muffled prisoner voices get preserved as audio demonstrations that allow visitors to hear architectural sound effects without experiencing psychological effects that made architectural acoustics effective for institutional control. Cell lighting that provided minimal illumination for prisoner survival gets supplemented with educational lighting that allows visitor comprehension without creating visitor discomfort that would replicate prisoner experience accurately. Sanitation facilities that created systematic hygiene deprivation get restored to contemporary standards that maintain visitor comfort while eliminating historical accuracy that would demonstrate institutional oppression through direct experience. Ventilation systems that created controlled discomfort get modified to provide visitor comfort while maintaining architectural appearance that suggests historical conditions without creating historical experience. The oil mill gets reconstructed as static display that demonstrates forced labor principles without requiring labor performance, institutional oppression theory without institutional oppression practice, historical education without historical trauma. Information panels provide historical context that explains institutional operations, while visitors experience museum comfort rather than institutional discomfort. Education replaces experience. Knowledge substitutes for feeling. Intellectual understanding prevents emotional impact. Guided tours follow prescribed routes that maximize educational value while minimizing psychological impact. Visitors learn about systematic oppression from positions of comfort, safety, and voluntary participation that eliminate psychological elements that made systematic oppression effective. The most problematic curatorial choice involves prisoner representation. How do you display human suffering without creating human suffering? How do you document systematic oppression without systematically oppressing? How do you preserve historical truth without reproducing historical trauma? Wax figures provide physical representation without human presence, educational demonstration without human experience, visual accuracy without emotional authenticity. Visitors see prisoner bodies without experiencing prisoner psychology. Audio recordings of survivor testimony provide historical voices without historical presence, personal accounts without personal encounter, documented experience without direct experience. Visitors hear about suffering without feeling suffering. Photographic displays document institutional operations while maintaining safe distance between historical evidence and contemporary experience. Visitors observe institutional horror through media rather than architecture, image rather than space. Written accounts provide detailed description of institutional operations while allowing visitors to control information consumption according to personal comfort levels. Reading about trauma differs qualitatively from experiencing trauma. The memorial succeeds in educating visitors about institutional operations while protecting visitors from institutional impact. But education without impact provides knowledge without understanding, information without comprehension, historical awareness without historical consciousness. Visitors learn that systematic oppression occurred without understanding how systematic oppression felt, acknowledge institutional horror without experiencing institutional power, recognize colonial control without feeling colonial helplessness. The museum preserves historical memory while eliminating historical meaning, documents institutional operations while preventing institutional understanding, maintains architectural form while eliminating architectural function. Tourism converts institutional spaces into recreational spaces, prisoner cells into photo opportunities, suffering architecture into entertainment architecture. Visitors take pictures in locations where systematic photography documented systematic dehumanization. The irony is perfect and unacknowledged. People voluntarily visit spaces designed to eliminate voluntary action, enjoy architecture designed to eliminate enjoyment, experience freedom in spaces designed to eliminate freedom. Yet museum conversion also creates positive historical consciousness through educational programming that acknowledges colonial oppression, documents resistance strategies, and honors political prisoners whose struggle contributed to independence movements. School groups learn about systematic oppression through direct architectural experience that textbooks cannot provide. Students understand institutional control through spatial relationship that classroom instruction cannot replicate. International visitors gain historical knowledge about colonial control methods that influences contemporary understanding of systematic oppression, institutional power, and resistance strategies applicable beyond specific historical context. Memorial functions honor political prisoners whose suffering contributed to independence struggle while educating contemporary populations about resistance history that continues inspiring political action against contemporary oppression. The Cellular Jail becomes educational institution that serves liberation through historical consciousness rather than oppression through historical unconsciousness. The building teaches resistance rather than enforcing submission. But the most powerful educational element is architectural experience itself. The physical sensation of walking through corridors designed for institutional control, standing in cells designed for human isolation, observing surveillance systems designed for systematic monitoring. Even modified for museum use, the architecture retains psychological impact that demonstrates institutional power through spatial relationship, systematic control through architectural design, oppressive intention through environmental experience. Visitors understand institutional oppression through architectural education that provides knowledge unavailable through any other medium. The building teaches through physical presence what written accounts cannot communicate through intellectual description. The museum succeeds in converting institutional architecture into resistance education, oppressive space into liberating space, colonial control monument into independence struggle memorial. The Cellular Jail becomes monument to resistance rather than submission, human triumph rather than institutional triumph, historical consciousness rather than historical amnesia. But questions remain. Does preservation honor suffering or exploit suffering? Does education prevent repetition or enable repetition? Does memory serve liberation or control? The building provides no answers. Only questions that each visitor must answer individually through personal reflection on institutional power, systematic oppression, and human resistance that transcends architectural control. Yet the questions themselves constitute the building's most valuable educational contribution, challenging contemporary consciousness about institutional power, systematic control, and resistance possibilities that remain relevant beyond specific historical context. The Cellular Jail teaches the most important lesson any building can teach. Architecture serves human purposes, but human purposes can transform architecture, and human resistance can ultimately triumph over any institutional control that architecture enables. But the question remains, where did the blueprint go next? The oil mill stands silent now, a reconstructed monument to systematic oppression displayed for educational purposes rather than operational requirements. But the principles it embodied, forced productivity, measured suffering, industrial dehumanization, didn't disappear with institutional closure. The Kolhu mechanism that ground men like grain survives in contemporary systems that process human beings through institutional requirements disguised as economic necessity. legal procedure, or administrative efficiency. The technology changes, but the underlying logic remains constant. Modern prisons utilize architectural principles pioneered at the cellular jail: surveillance through design, isolation through structure, control through environmental management. The panopticon evolved into electronic monitoring, digital surveillance, and algorithmic control that operates with precision that mechanical systems could never achieve. Contemporary immigration detention centers employ spatial isolation, systematic dehumanization, and bureaucratic processing that converts individual human beings into administrative units through procedures that echo cellular jail intake protocols. The uniforms differ, but the underlying purpose remains identical. Corporate labor practices that demand productivity quotas, surveillance monitoring, and systematic exhaustion utilize principles that the oil mill demonstrated through mechanical rather than digital enforcement. The tools evolve, but the relationships remain constant. Educational institutions that process students through standardized testing, behavioral modification, and systematic compliance training operate according to institutional logic that treats human development as quality control problem requiring systematic intervention through environmental design. Psychiatric facilities that utilize isolation therapy, behavioral modification, and pharmaceutical control demonstrate refined applications of cellular principles adapted for medical rather than penal justification, but achieving similar results through institutional rather than architectural control. Elder care facilities that warehouse aging populations through systematic isolation, controlled dependency, and managed deterioration represent architectural solutions to demographic problems that treat human beings as administrative challenges requiring institutional processing. The most disturbing contemporary application appears in urban planning that utilizes environmental design for population control, housing projects that concentrate poverty, transportation systems that limit mobility, commercial development that controls access to resources and opportunities, digital surveillance systems that monitor behavior, predict resistance, and modify compliance operate according to panopticon principles adapted for technological rather than architectural implementation, but serving identical purposes through different mechanisms. Social media platforms that shape consciousness, influence behavior, and manage population psychology utilize systematic attention control that makes the cellular jail's isolation techniques seem primitive by comparison, while serving similar functions through voluntary rather than involuntary participation. Economic systems that force participation in degrading labor through systematic resource deprivation operate according to Kolhu principles adapted for market rather than institutional implementation, but achieving identical results through financial rather than physical coercion. The blueprint didn't disappear. It became invisible, integrated into systems that operate according to cellular jail principles while denying cellular jail intentions. Contemporary institutional control operates through voluntary compliance that eliminates need for architectural coercion. Modern populations submit to surveillance, isolation, systematic labor, and environmental control through personal choice rather than legal compulsion, economic necessity rather than physical force, technological convenience rather than architectural design. The cellular jail failed because its control methods remained visible, its oppression remained obvious, its institutional violence remained undeniable. Contemporary systems succeed by making identical control methods invisible, oppression imperceptible, institutional violence deniable. But resistance strategies that political prisoners developed at the cellular jail remain relevant for contemporary application. Collective action, systematic non-cooperation, alternative communication networks, mutual aid systems, and organized refusal to participate in institutional requirements. The hunger strike demonstrated power that remains available to any population willing to coordinate systematic non-participation in systems that depend on population cooperation for operational success. Contemporary systems remain vulnerable to organized refusal. Communication networks that operated through surveillance failures remain possible wherever surveillance systems contain human rather than purely technological elements. Human networks can exploit systematic vulnerabilities in technological surveillance just as they exploited architectural surveillance Mutual aid systems that supported political prisoners through institutional oppression provide models for contemporary communities resisting systematic economic pressure, environmental assault, or political marginalization. Educational networks that maintained political consciousness despite isolation provide techniques for preserving critical awareness, despite contemporary propaganda systems, information manipulation, and systematic historical distortion. The most important lesson from cellular jail resistance is that institutional control depends on population psychology rather than institutional capability. Systems that seem invincible become vulnerable when populations refuse psychological compliance with systematic oppression. Contemporary institutions possess technological capabilities that exceed cellular jail architectural capabilities by orders of magnitude, but they remain vulnerable to resistance strategies that target institutional psychology rather than institutional technology. The cellular jail demonstrated that systematic resistance can defeat systematic oppression when resistance strategies utilize institutional weaknesses rather than opposing institutional strengths directly. Contemporary applications require adaptation to technological rather than architectural contexts, but the fundamental principles remain constant. Institutional control requires population cooperation. Systematic oppression depends on individual isolation. Architectural power needs psychological acceptance, and human resistance can triumph over any institutional system that underestimates human capacity for collective action. The blueprint went everywhere, but so did the resistance manual. Contemporary populations have access to both institutional control techniques and resistance strategies that the cellular jail demonstrated through practical experience. The choice remains the same as it was for political prisoners facing oil mill quotas and cellular isolation. Submit to systematic oppression or organize systematic resistance. The tools evolved, but the fundamental decision remains identical. And the oil mill echo continues reverberating through contemporary systems that grind human beings into institutional products through procedures that serve systematic rather than individual purposes. The sound hasn't stopped. We've just learned not to hear it. But learning to hear institutional violence again becomes the first step toward organized resistance that can stop the grinding by refusing to feed the machine with human cooperation it requires for continued operation. The question isn't whether systematic oppression continues. It does. The question is whether contemporary populations will organize systematic resistance or submit to systematic processing through institutional systems that convert human potential into institutional profit. The cellular jail provides both warning and inspiration. Institutional control remains possible, but institutional resistance remains effective when properly organized through collective action that exploits systematic vulnerabilities rather than opposing systematic strength. The blueprint survived, but so did the resistance manual. Both remain available for contemporary application by populations willing to study institutional history for practical rather than academic purposes. The machine continues operating, but it can still be broken by people who refuse to serve as its components. The choice remains ours. The tower stands empty now, its lantern extinguished, its surveillance apparatus converted into historical display that documents panopticon theory without implementing panopticon practice. Wind moves through corridors that once carried authorities' footsteps toward cells that contained human hope systematically. From the central observation point, the view encompasses 7 wings that radiate outward like spokes of a wheel that once ground human beings into institutional compliance, but now serves only architectural memory of systematic oppression that seemed permanent until it proved temporary. The sightlines that provided perfect institutional control over populations, determined to resist institutional control, remain geometrically perfect but operationally meaningless. Architecture outlasts administration, but architectural purpose dies when administrative purpose fails. The building succeeded as institutional experiment in total environmental control, but failed as political experiment in permanent human subjugation. The cellular jail proved that architecture can contain bodies but cannot contain souls, can limit physical movement but cannot eliminate spiritual resistance. Political prisoners who entered these cells as individuals emerged as collective force that contributed to independence movements that ultimately eliminated colonial authority, that constructed cellular architecture for permanent imperial control. The machine created its own destruction through systematic oppression that generated systematic resistance. Guards who operated institutional machinery discovered they were processing populations whose political commitment transformed punishment into education, isolation into meditation, suffering into strength. The machine educated its enemies through operational procedures designed to eliminate enemy capability. Administrative personnel who implemented cellular policies created documentation that provided evidence of systematic oppression used by resistance movements to justify resistance activities and generate international support for independence movements that eliminated administrative authority. The institutional experiment demonstrated that systematic oppression produces systematic resistance, environmental control creates environmental adaptation, and architectural precision enables human precision in exploiting architectural weakness through coordinated action. Every institutional strength became institutional vulnerability when confronted by populations that understood institutional psychology well enough to exploit institutional blindness, predict institutional responses, and coordinate resistance activities during institutional confusion. The building's most sophisticated control mechanisms, surveillance, isolation, systematic routine, became resistance tools when populations learned to communicate through surveillance systems, organize through isolation procedures, and coordinate through systematic timing. The cellular jail failed in the way all dystopian systems eventually fail, not through external assault, but through internal contradiction between systematic oppression and human adaptation that transforms oppressive systems into educational systems that teach resistance rather than submission. The institution that was designed to eliminate political resistance instead created political education that produced more effective resistance than existed before institutional processing began. The machine backfired through successful operation that achieved opposite results from intended outcomes. But the failure teaches lessons about institutional power that remain relevant beyond specific historical context. Systematic oppression contains systematic vulnerabilities. Environmental control creates environmental opportunities, and architectural precision enables precise resistance when populations understand institutional operations. Contemporary institutions that utilize cellular jail principles remain vulnerable to resistance strategies that cellular jail prisoners developed through practical experience with systematic oppression, administered through environmental control and architectural design. The building demonstrates that human resistance adapts faster than institutional control, individual creativity exceeds systematic planning, and collective action can defeat any architectural system that underestimates human capacity for organized non-cooperation with institutional requirements. The most important lesson emerges from architectural contrast between institutional intention and institutional result. Buildings designed to break human spirits instead strengthened human spirits. Isolation designed to prevent organization instead enabled organization, and surveillance designed to eliminate resistance instead documented resistance effectiveness. The cellular jail stands as monument to institutional failure disguised as administrative success, architectural achievement that served political disaster, engineering precision that enabled systematic imprecision in achieving systematic goals through systematic methods. Yet the building also demonstrates institutional persistence through architectural survival that outlasts political survival, systematic capability that survives systematic application, and environmental control potential that waits for future justification, regardless of past failure. The empty tower watches over empty wings that retain complete capability for future operational implementation whenever political circumstances justify architectural resurrection. The machine sleeps but doesn't die, waits but doesn't disappear, and in that persistence lies the building's most disturbing lesson. Institutional capacity survives institutional failure. Architectural control capabilities remain available regardless of political decisions about architectural utilization. And systematic oppression remains possible whenever populations submit to systematic processing. The cellular jail succeeded as architectural experiment in environmental control, while failing as political experiment in permanent human control. The building works perfectly. The politics proved temporary, but the architecture remains permanent. Contemporary populations inherit both institutional warning and resistance inspiration from cellular jail history. Systematic oppression remains possible, but systematic resistance remains effective when properly organized through collective action that exploits institutional psychology rather than opposing institutional capability. The building teaches that institutional control depends on population psychology more than architectural capability. Systematic oppression requires individual cooperation more than environmental design, and human resistance needs organizational skill more than revolutionary ideology. The most powerful lesson emerges from simple observation. The building stands empty because human resistance proved stronger than architectural control. Political commitment transcended environmental pressure, and collective action overcame systematic isolation through organized non-cooperation with institutional requirements. The cellular jail demonstrates that freedom requires no permission, resistance needs no authorization, and human dignity survives systematic assault when people refuse systematic participation in their own oppression through coordinated action based on shared commitment to human liberation. The tower stands silent, but its silence speaks volumes about human capacity for resistance, institutional vulnerability to organized non-cooperation, and architectural limitation when confronted by populations that understand institutional psychology well enough to exploit institutional weakness systematically. The wind carries salt spray from the Bay of Bengal through corridors designed to contain human breath but unable to exclude natural forces that operate according to physical laws, indifferent to human institutional pretensions about environmental control and architectural authority. The building endures as monument to its own limitations, architectural achievement that served institutional failure, engineering precision that enabled political imprecision in achieving systematic control through systematic oppression of populations that refused systematic submission. But the building also endures as inspiration for contemporary resistance, historical education that demonstrates resistance effectiveness, and architectural documentation that human spirits cannot be broken by any environmental control system that humans can design, construct, or operate. The cellular jail stands empty, waiting, but it waits not for institutional resurrection, but for historical understanding that teaches contemporary populations how to resist systematic oppression through collective action, based on lessons that political prisoners learned through direct experience with institutional violence. The building's greatest achievement wasn't systematic control. It was systematic education of populations that learned to resist systematic control through organized action that proved more systematic than institutional oppression ever achieved. And that education continues through empty corridors that echo with footsteps of visitors who learn resistance history through architectural experience that textbooks cannot provide, museum displays cannot replicate, and academic analysis cannot communicate. The cellular jail succeeds as educational institution by failing as correctional institution, achieves historical importance through operational insignificance, and provides contemporary inspiration through past failure to achieve systematic human submission through systematic human oppression. The building stands as proof that human resistance ultimately triumphs over institutional control. Architectural precision yields to human precision, and systematic oppression generates systematic resistance that proves more durable than oppressive systems ever become. The Tower Watch has ended, but the human watch continues. The building sleeps, but human consciousness remains awake. The machine is silent, but human voices carry resistance songs across distances that no architecture can measure or contain. The cellular jail's final lesson echoes through empty spaces that once contained human lives, but could never contain human hope. Buildings serve human purposes, but human purposes can transform buildings, and human resistance can ultimately triumph over any institutional control that architecture enables. The wind continues moving through corridors that carry no authority, serve no oppression, contain no prisoners. Just air moving through space that once housed systematic violence, but now houses only memory, historical consciousness, and architectural proof that freedom requires no permission, only courage to refuse systematic participation in systematic oppression. The building remembers what happened here. But more importantly, it remembers what's still possible when people refuse to forget that institutional control depends on human cooperation that can be withdrawn whenever populations choose resistance over submission. The cellular jail stands empty, but not abandoned. It waits for visitors who will learn resistance rather than submission, understand possibility rather than limitation, and carry historical consciousness into contemporary action that honors political prisoners who prove that human dignity survives any institutional assault when defended through collective action based on shared commitment to human liberation. The machine is silent, but its silence speaks truth. Systematic oppression fails when confronted by systematic resistance. Institutional violence yields to organized nonviolence, and architectural control collapses when populations refuse psychological cooperation with physical containment. The building's final gift to human consciousness is proof that resistance works, hope survives, and freedom remains possible regardless of institutional pretensions about permanent control, through architectural design and administrative procedure. The cellular jail stands as monument not to systematic oppression, but to systematic resistance that ultimately defeated systematic oppression through human action that proved more systematic than any institutional system ever achieves. And in that victory lies permanent hope that transcends temporary architecture, outlasts institutional politics, and continues inspiring human resistance to systematic oppression wherever such resistance becomes necessary for human dignity and human freedom. The wind moves freely through corridors designed to restrict movement, carrying scents of tropical vegetation that reclaim spaces designed for human containment, but now serve only environmental freedom and historical education about human freedom that no architecture can contain permanently. The building stands. The resistance continues. The choice remains ours.